Today we are going to be talking about the digestive system. So let me go ahead and open this up here. Is everyone able to see the PowerPoint?
Not. Oh yeah. Yes.
Okay. All right. So actually, before I forget, just to going through a couple of announcements again. Don't forget that this this upcoming Monday, we're going to have our last homework assignment due, and then we are also going to have the career essay that will also be due.
Mm-hmm.
So don't forget to do the career essay if you haven't already. So make sure you get that done. I'll put that over here on the side. Career essay due Monday, and then the last homework, which I just published today, so you can see it on Canvas, which covers chapter 22 and 24. That is also available on Canvas. That will be due on Monday as well. There is an extra credit lab for this week. That was the endocrine lab, so that will be due on Friday. So whenever you get that done, go ahead and submit that on Canvas, and then you'll be good to go for that too.
That's our last lab, correct?
No, we will still have some labs next week. So we still got a couple more. Yeah. Let's see, that's that. And then the final exam will be Wednesday, May 20th. So like I said, that'll be 100 questions. Questions 1 through 50 will be the new stuff. So chapters 22 and 24 through 26. Questions, 51 through 90. Those are going to be from the old material or from the old exams. And then questions 90 to 100 are going to be organ identification questions. So that's what we got coming up. And I'm trying to think if there's any extra things. I think that's everything. I think that's the last few things that are happening. Any questions on what's coming up?
No, I think it's pretty much clear, and you mentioned a few times so far, so that's good.
Okay, cool.
Set in stone.
All right, so yeah, like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or feel free to get in touch, and I'll try to answer those questions as best as I can. Cool. Okay, so that's that. So today we're going to be talking about the digestive system. So we'll go ahead and just kind of start here. So right off the bat, what do we know about the digestive system? What is its? What do we know? What's its functions? Tell me everything you know about the digestive system going forward. Okay, so off the bat.
Helps to break down food.
Right, so it's going to help to break down food. Cool. What else do we know?
Reabsorption of food and the nutrients and liquid.
Okay, so it's going to help with absorbing nutrients. Cool. What else?
A mechanical process and a chemical process.
Yes, so there's going to be a mechanical process and there's going to be a physical, chemical process. All right.
Isn't it like a continuous tube or something, and it's like from mouth to anus?
Yes, it actually is, and I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to mention that earlier today. So the GI tract is actually one really long tube, all the way from your mouth down to your anus. It's all one long tube. It just looks different in different places. So it's just one really long tube. Good. Cool. What else do we know?
It has main organs and accessory organs.
Okay. So there's going to be some main GI organs, and there's going to be some accessory organs. Okay. What else?
Isn't it very acidic?
Yeah, so there's parts of it that are very acidic. However, there are also some parts that are going to be pretty alkaline too. So we'll take a look at that too. So parts are acidic. Cool. And the acid is going to play a pretty important role, which we'll talk about later. Cool. Anything else?
It's a 7-process step from like ingestion, propulsion to defecation being that last one, right?
Yes. So it's 6 to 7 processes, yeah. 6 to 7 processes. Okay. Cool. Anything else? Good job, Valerie.
think so.
Anything else? Okay, that's pretty good. We got a pretty good list here. So we can see helps to break down food. I'll just kind of move this over here. Helps to break down food. It's going to help to absorb lots of nutrients. The digestive process is going to have a mechanical and chemical components to it. It's going to be one super long tube that's going to run all the way from your mouth down to your butthole. It's going to have some main GI organs as well as some accessory organs. There's some parts that are going to be acidic, and that's going to really be important later. And there's going to be a multi-step kind of process from beginning to end. So we'll take a look at all of those. All right, now another question. We have, I guess, three major, types of foods, right? What are those three major food types?
Macronutrients and micronutrients. And
what kind of macronutrients?
well, you have
So think about like the types of foods we eat.
like we have smaller ones like I want to say iron, calcium, like those types, and then we have larger ones like proteins and carbohydrates.
Yes, that's what I'm looking for. So we got proteins, we got carbohydrates,
Yeah, lipids.
and then there's one more, lipids, right? Or lipids, which are our fats.
Yeah.
Okay. So someone tell me your favorite type of protein. Favorite type of protein.
Tofu.
Steak.
Steak? I
Salmon.
like it. I like it. Steak. I haven't had a steak in a while. That sounds super good. What about our favorite types of carbohydrates? Favorite types of carbs?
Bread.
Oh, bread. Yes. Yes. Bread. Cool. And then favorite type of lipid? Favorite type of fatty stuff?
Avocado.
Avocado.
Okay, avocados. Yes.
You on that?
All right.
Yeah.
Cool. So I like this. So I like it. So we got lots of types of proteins, right? So we got steaks, we got chicken, we got turkey, we got burgers. Those are all different types of proteins. And so those are all going to be digested in a very specific manner. Okay, so we're going to be looking at how we're going to be able to break all that stuff down. Okay. Same thing with carbohydrates. We got breads, we got pastas, which are my absolute favorite. Those are like different types of carbohydrates, and those are going to be digested in a number of ways in different places as well. And then we got lipids. So we got avocados, we got butter, we got cream cheese, we got whipped cream. So all of those are different types of lipids that we're going to be able to consume and be able to digest and then absorb in different parts of the body. Okay. So today, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at all the different parts that are going to be responsible for the digestive processes, and we're going to be looking at specific enzymes that are going to help us to break down different types of proteins and break down different carbohydrates and which ones break down lipids. Okay. So today's going to be our foodie lecture, and so we're going to have a good time for this one. Cool. All right. So that's going to be where we're going today. So just kind of as a recap, basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at all the parts of the digestive system and the different processes. We're going to be looking at the layers of the GI tract, and then we're going to look at all the different organs of the digestive system that help us to be able to break down food and absorb food, and then kind of absorb all those nutrients. And then we're going to look at the enzymes that are going to be important for all those different processes. So that's where we're going. That's going to be what we're doing here. So this is our digestive system. So when we think about the digestive system, as you guys mentioned earlier, this is the part of the system that is responsible for breaking down foods into smaller components and into smaller molecules. Now, those smaller molecules, those smaller nutrients like we're going to be breaking down, or that we're going to be getting here, are going to be able to be used by the body for energy and be able to be used in order to allow ourselves and the rest of our organs and our bodies to be able to do what they need to do. Okay. So the first part of the digestive system is going to be made up of the gastrointestinal tract, or the GI tract. And so this is going to be made up of one really long tube, like Valerie had mentioned earlier. So it starts with your mouth, then the pharynx, the esophagus, then we reach the stomach, and then the small intestine and the large intestine. Yeah. So this is one really long tube, and it's very compactly folded. Not just kind of folded within itself, but all the organs are going to have lots of very small kind of microscopic folds in it as well. Okay. And so if you were to take the entire GI tract and you completely unravel it and stretch it all the way out, it would be about the size of a tennis court. Okay. And so that's pretty incredible that we're able to take all those organs, that very large, very expansive organ with such a large surface area, and stuff it basically into our abdominal cavity. And so because there's such a high surface area, that's going to be able to ensure that we're going to be able to absorb as much nutrients as we possibly can from this tract. So GI tract is really cool, really cool. Then the second set of organs are called the accessory organs, and so these are going to be the organs that that kind of assist with the digestive process. Okay? They don't actually do anything in terms of helping you to absorb it or absorb nutrients, but they do help with the breakdown process. Okay? So these are going to be the teeth, the tongue, the salivary glands, which you see up here. The liver is going to help with the digestive process. The gallbladder underneath it, and then the pancreas, which kind of sits behind. So all these are going to be the accessory organs. Okay. So when we look at the functions of the digestive system, there's going to be 6 overall functions. The first function is with ingestion. Okay. So when we think about ingestion, ingestion is the process of taking in food, right? So we can't digest any food if we don't get it into our mouth in the first place. Okay? So ingestion is the process of taking in food and liquid into the mouth and then being able to swallow it from there. Okay. That's the first process. The second one is secretion. Okay, and so at different parts of the GI tract and different parts of the digestive system, we're going to be secreting lots of water, we're going to be secreting some acid, a few buffers, and then we're going to be secreting lots of enzymes that are going to help us with the whole breakdown process for all these digestive organs or digestive processes here. Okay. That's function number 2. Okay. Number 3 is we need our GI tract and our digestive system to be pretty mobile. It needs to be able to have lots of contractions and relaxations. And so that's what we call motility. Okay? It's ability to contract and relax to help move food from point A to point B. And in doing so, it's going to help to either mix the food with some of the digestive juices or kind of propel the food forward down along the rest of the GI tract. Okay. So that's motility. Okay. The fourth function is with digestion, as we know. And so digestion is the process where we're going to be breaking down food into smaller components so that we can then be able to absorb it. Okay? So digestion is going to happen in 2 different ways. The first one is going to be with mechanical digestion. And so that's going to be where we're actually able to physically break down the food using some cutting actions or some grinding actions, typically by the teeth or by the stomach as it churns, or the small intestines to a lesser degree. So that's going to be where you're actually physically breaking down the food into smaller bits. And then we can have chemical digestion. Okay? So chemical digestion is where we take lots of enzymes that we release from the salivary glands, the tongue, the stomach, the pancreas, and the small intestines. If we take all those enzymes and we break down those smaller carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins into even smaller, more microscopic units. Okay? And so as we break them into much smaller components, that's going to be able to allow us to absorb those nutrients. Okay. All right. Then the 5th function is the absorption process. Okay. So digestion doesn't do us any good. It doesn't do us any good to break down all these different food particles if we can't absorb it. All right. So it doesn't do us any good for the stuff to just stay inside the lumen of our GI tract and then not do anything with it. So what we're going to do after we break all those different substances down is we're going to move them through the cells of our intestines or the rest of our GI tract. Okay. Move them through these cells called enterocytes, which are the intestinal cells. Okay. Move them through these enterocytes and then into the blood. Okay. As those nutrients enter the blood or the lymph, they can then be circulated throughout the body and then delivered to specific organs and structures for either storage or for use. Okay. So that's the 5th function. Okay. The last function is defecation. That's going to be the pooping process. Okay. So anything that we were not able to digest, any waste that we weren't able to use, any bacteria, any sloughed off epithelial cells from the GI tract, or anything that we were able to digest but never had a chance to absorb, okay, all of those substances are going to end up leaving the body as our feces or our poop. Okay. So that's going to be the last process, the defecation process, where we get rid of all the stuff that we weren't able to utilize before, okay, or that we didn't want to utilize. Okay. So those are the 6 functions of the digestive system. Okay. Any questions on any of those 6 functions? Okay.
No, we're good.
Yeah.
All right, cool. All right, so as we look at the GI tract is going to be made up into 4 different layers. Okay. So the innermost layer is going to be the mucosa, which we see here. The second layer surrounding that is going to be the submucosa, which we see right here. Okay. The third layer is the muscularis, and then the fourth layer is the serosa. So we're going to take a look at these different components here. And so we're going to start with the mucosa. And so like we said, the mucosa is the inner lining of the GI tract. And so this is the part of the GI tract that that our food is going to be making direct contact with. So our food is going to be making contact with the mucosa of our GI tract. So the mucosa is going to be made up of epithelium, and it's going to be made up of different types of epithelium depending on where you are in the digestive tract. So for parts of it, there's going to be some stratified squamous epithelium, specifically in the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, and the anal canal. Okay. Anyone have an idea why it would make sense for us to have stratified squamous epithelium in that area, in the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, and anal canal?
Would it be protection?
Exactly, for protection, right? So we're looking at the mouth, we're going to be taking all kinds of foods, right? So if we're eating an apple, for example, or we're eating that steak, the steak is going to be making direct contact with the mouth. Okay, there's going to be big chunks of steak that might be kind of sharp, or big chunks that could cause some damage. Okay? And so by having that stratified squamous epithelium, it helps to make sure that the underlying tissues or the underlying cells of those areas are protected. So it gives a little bit of extra toughness to those areas that are going to be in direct contact, experiencing lots of friction with the food.
Mm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. Cool. So that's going to be the stratified squamous epithelium in the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, and the anal. Okay. Now in the stomach and the small intestines, we're going to have lots of simple columnar epithelium. And so if you remember from chapter 3, I believe it was, simple columnar epithelium allows us to have lots of extra secretion and lots of absorption abilities. Okay. So in the stomach and the small intestines, there's going to be lots of secreting, acid. There's secreting of different hormones and different, substances, okay, enzymes, and things like that. Okay. And then we also want to be able to absorb as much of those nutrients as we possibly can. Okay. So that's why we're going to have simple columnar epithelium in those areas. Now, in addition to that, in addition to the simple columnar epithelium, there's also going to be some exocrine cells that are going to be secreting some mucus, as well as some enteroendocrine cells that are going to be secreting some hormones that are going to help with the digestive processes as well. And we'll take a look at a couple of those hormones later. All right, so in addition to the mucosa, the epithelium, there's also going to be some lamina propria that's going to be surrounding the epithelium. And so the lamina propria, you don't need to worry about too much, but this is going to be where the blood vessels are going to be that are going to help to absorb those nutrients. The blood and the lymphatic vessels inside the lamina propria is where those nutrients are going to get absorbed, and then from there they're going to get delivered and circulated throughout the body and eventually move to the heart. And so the lamina propria also helps to support the muscularis mucosa, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, also inside the lamina propria, there's going to be some lymphatic tissue called MALT, or mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, and that's going to contain a lot of lymphatic nodules that are going to help to destroy any pathogens or any bacteria that we might have ingested. Okay? So it's going to kind of serve an immune function role here as well. Okay. The third component of the mucosa is called the muscularis mucosa. And so this is going to be a very, very thin layer of smooth muscle. And that is going to pretty much typically going to be found only in the stomach and the small intestine. But because there's lots of smooth muscle here, this is going to have to create a little bit of extra surface area. And so again, with more surface area, the better our ability for digestion and absorption are going to be. So they're going to create a little bit of folds inside the muscularis mucosa here. And that will ultimately lead to some extra folds inside the mucosa as a whole. Okay? So because there's going to be some contractions taking place in the muscularis mucosa, it's going to be able to create some contractions, and those contractions are going to ensure that all of the absorptive cells inside the mucosa are going to be exposed to those GI contents, so they can absorb as much nutrients as possible. Okay? So as the muscularis mucosa contracts, it's going to ensure that all of the absorptive cells have access to those nutrients. So Valerie's question is, doesn't this also line the mouth? Not as much. There is a muscle inside the mouth, but it's not really going to line the mouth area. But we will see some muscle somewhere else, though. Okay. All right, so that's all found in the mucosa. We have the epithelium of the innermost layer, and then we have the lamina propria surrounding that, and then the muscularis mucosa on the outside of that. That's all the first layer of the GI tract. This is the mucosa. Then we have the second layer, which is the submucosa. And so the submucosa is going to be made up of lots of collagen fibers and nerves and blood vessels. So there's going to be lots of connective tissue in this particular area. And so what the submucosa's role is to do is it's basically going to be binding the mucosa, kind of more deep to it, to the muscularis that's going to be more superficial to it. Okay? So it's going to help to attach those two structures and keep them bound together. Inside the submucosa, there's going to be a nerve plexus that is part of the enteric nervous system. And this is called the submucosal plexus. So this submucosal plexus is going to have lots of sensory and motor neurons. And so it's going to help to regulate the movement of the mucosa. And it's also going to be able to cause vasoconstriction of some of the blood vessels within it as well. Okay? In addition to that, it's also going to innervate some of the mucosal glands to help secrete some extra mucus when necessary. All right, so that's the submucosa. Any questions on the mucosa and the submucosa so far? Okay. All right. And the third layer is the muscularis, and this is different from the muscularis mucosa that we saw in the mucosa layer. So the muscularis is going to be made up of skeletal muscle inside the mouth, the pharynx, and the superior and middle parts of the esophagus, as well as the external anal sphincter. Okay? So because all of these areas are made up of skeletal muscle, these are areas that we can voluntarily control. Okay? Everywhere else, we're going to have our muscularis being made up of just smooth muscle. Okay? So these are things that we're not going to be able to control. Okay? So the muscularis is going to be made up of basically two sheets of muscle fibers. There's going to be a circular sheet or an inner sheet of circular fibers, and then an outer sheet that's going to be made up of more longitudinal fibers. And so because we have these two sheets of muscle fibers here, that is going to help us to increase the efficiency of the movement process of moving our food from area 1 to area 2, or point A to point B. Okay. So in addition to that, those extra contractions will also help with kind of mixing the food with the digestive secretions, as well as helping with the breakdown of different molecules as well, of food particles. Okay. Now also inside the muscularis, there's going to be another plexus here, which is called the myenteric plexus. Okay. And so the myenteric plexus is, again, part of the enteric nervous system, but its job is just to help with the GI motility, okay, helping with the movement of the GI tract. Okay, so that's the muscularis. And then the last region is the serosa. Okay, so the serosa is going to be the most superficial layer of the GI tract. And so it's going to basically attach the GI, or different organs of the GI tract to the abdominal pelvic cavity, or to different areas within the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay. So the serosa is going to be made up of a serous membrane. And so it's going to be made up of mostly simple squamous epithelium with some underlying connective tissue. And so it's going to be secreting a serous fluid, okay, just like any other serous membrane would. Okay. The serous fluid that it produces helps to kind of lubricate the outer walls of the serosa, so that if it does kind of rub up against any other structures around the GI tract, it doesn't cause any abrasions as it rubs up against any neighboring organs. Okay. So the serosa is going to be found all the way throughout the GI tract, with the exception of the esophagus and with the rectum. So the esophagus and the rectum will not have a serosa. Instead, they'll have what's called an adventitia, which is just a single layer of connective tissue. So it's not going to have the epithelial component to that the serosa has. Okay, so those are the 4 layers of the GI tract. Okay. All right, so now we're going to kind of take a look at the epithelial tract, of the digestive system as a whole. But before we can get into that, we're first going to be looking at the whole cavity that our organs are going to be found within. Okay? The abdominal organ, or the abdominal cavity, I should say, is what we refer to as the peritoneum. Okay? So the peritoneum is going to be the serous membrane that lines the abdominal cavity. And so again, it's going to be made up of squamous epithelium with some connective tissue underlying it. Okay? But that connective tissue that underlies the squamous epithelium here is going to be made up of mostly fat. Okay? So because this is a serous membrane, again, we're going to find two different regions. Okay? There's going to be a parietal peritoneum, and the parietal peritoneum is going to line the abdominal cavity, the abdominal wall, I should say. Okay? And then the visceral peritoneum is going to sit on top of the organs. So the visceral peritoneum is basically the serosa. Okay? So the parietal peritoneum lines the perimeter of your abdominal wall, or the periphery of the abdominal wall, and then the visceral peritoneum actually sits on top of the organs. Okay? That's the serosa. Okay? In between the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum, you're going to have the peritoneal cavity, and that is going to be where we see the serous fluid. And so again, that serous fluid is going to help to make sure that our organs are not going to cause any abrasions or develop any abrasions as they rub up against any other organs inside the abdominal cavity. Now, any organs that lie at the posterior side of the peritoneum are referred to as retroperitoneal organs. So we'll look at a couple of those, but these are just walls or organs that don't penetrate into the main peritoneal area. Okay, so that is the peritoneum. So as we kind of look more in depth at the peritoneum, if we were kind of open up the abdominal cavity, the first layer the first kind of thing we're going to see is called the greater omentum. Okay. So the greater omentum is a fold of the peritoneum that sits and covers the small intestine as well as parts of the colon. Okay. And so the greater omentum is made up of almost entirely adipose tissue. Okay. So if you were to kind of cut open the abdominal cavity, the first thing you're going to see is the greater omentum. That's almost called, or it's sometimes referred to or nicknamed the fatty apron, because it basically just drapes over the small intestine and the colon areas. Okay. So the other thing about the greater omentum is, if you've ever seen someone with a beer belly, the reason they develop a beer belly is because when they drink like lots of beer, the beer adds to the fat that's inside the greater omentum. Okay. And so the greater omentum essentially swells and grows until it kind of protrudes forward, and then we kind of see that individual with what we consider a beer belly. And that's kind of where that kind of comes into play. Okay. So that's the greater omentum. It's basically going to be kind of protecting the small intestine and parts of the digestive system as well. Okay. Another ligament that we're going to see is called the falciform ligament. And so the falciform ligament is a part of or attaches the liver to the anterior portions of the abdominal wall as well as to the diaphragm. And then the third one that we're going to see is the lesser omentum. And so the lesser omentum is down here. And so it basically will attach the stomach and the duodenum, which is part of the small intestine, attaches those two structures to the liver. It kind of holds them all in place. And then the last major fold is the mesentery. And so the mesentery is kind of more at the posterior side of the peritoneal cavity. And basically what it does is it attaches the other two parts of the small intestine, the jejunum and the ileum. Okay. It attaches those guys to the posterior abdominal wall. Okay. And so that's what holds the small intestine in place and kind of keeps everything together. So this is the largest of the peritoneal folds. And like I said, it's going to wrap around the entirety of the small intestine. Okay. All right. Any questions so far?
No.
Mm-mm.
Okay, so this is what we would see if we were to open up a cadaver. So if you first open up the cadaver, you would again see the greater omentum before you would see any of the organs. Okay. Once you take apart the greater omentum and you flip it upward, okay, then you're going to be able to see, the small intestine, the large intestine, and all those structures down there.
George.
Okay, so question here. Oh yeah.
During, I remember, I think our last day when you showed us the cadaver, did you show us the greater momentum at all when we were going over them?
Yes. So when we're last together, in class, I believe I did. I don't remember for sure. But if you were to open up a cadaver, that would be what you would see. So I think I showed it to you, but I may be wrong. I might not have.
Okay, yeah, because it covers the intestine. That's what kind of like rung a bell in my head.
Yeah. So this is what kind of protects and kind of covers up all those organs. And so, actually, yeah. So yeah, I think I did show it to you because like when you open up the cadaver, you're gonna see that kind of fatty area that's more yellow, and then if you look on the interior portions of the skin, there's gonna be some of that fat there as well. That's part of the greater momentum too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good memory. Good memory. I like it. Okay, cool. So question here. So from superficial to deep, what is the correct order of the layers of the GI tract? What do we think here?
It's going to be B, serosa, muscularis, submucosa, mucosa.
Yeah,
I'm hearing B. Do we agree? Do we disagree?
I agree. Yeah.
Yes, B is correct. So if you're going from superficial to deep, the outer layer is going to be the serosa. Then you're going to have the muscularis, then the submucosa, and then the mucosa from there. Good. Perfect. All right, cool. Okay, so now we're going to look at all these different organs that are going to help with the digestive process. Okay. The first part is the mouth, which is going to help with the ingestion process. So the mouth is also called the oral cavity or the buccal cavity. It gets formed by the cheeks on the sides. The top part of the mouth is going to be made up of the hard and the soft palates. And then the tongue is also going to help with forming the mouth as well. Okay. So when we take a look at the cheeks, the external side of the cheeks is obviously going to be made up of skin, but the inside of your cheeks is going to be made up of a mucous membrane. Okay, so that mucous membrane, again, just kind of helps to protect the food, protect your mouth from any kind of abrasions from the food that you might otherwise develop. Inside the mouth is going to be some muscles, and so these are called the buccinator muscles. And so the buccinator muscles allow you to be able to control your mouth movements. You either open your mouth or close your mouth to help with the chewing process. So those are the muscles that really involved there. And then there's going to be some connective tissue in between the skin and the mucous membranes. And so the cheeks and the lips are also going to help with helping to take in the food and then keep the food inside your mouth and not let it like fall out. So looking at the mouth, the first thing we're going to see are the lips. Okay, so again, we're going to have a top lip and then a bottom lip. So these are going to help to kind of serve as the openings for the mouth. The lips are going to be attached to the gums by a little piece of tissue called the labial frenulum. So each lip is going to have one. And so the labial frenulum is going to be a kind of a little fold that's going to attach the midline of the lip to the gum. And then we're going to have a region called the fauces. And so the fauces is going to be just an opening that leads from the oral cavity into the oropharynx, which is going to help with the swallowing process. That is the lips portions. Okay. Then if we look at the roof of the mouth is going to be called the palate. And so the palate is going to help to separate the oral cavity from the nasal cavity above. The anterior parts of the palate is going to be made up of bone. So that's what we refer to as the hard palate. And specifically, this is going to be made up of the palatine bone. Okay. And so if you kind of feel the top part of your mouth, it's going to be pretty hard. And that's going to, again, because of a bone there. The posterior side is going to be made up of muscle. So we call that the soft palate. Now, at the back of the mouth, there's going to be a region called the uvula. And so the uvula is kind of a little finger-like structure that is at the back part of your mouth here. And so this structure doesn't really get a whole lot of love, but it actually serves a really important role. Okay? And so what happens is when you're swallowing, the uvula will go from a downward formation, and it's going to flap upward. Okay? And so as it flaps upward, it prevents any of the food or drinks that you're swallowing from entering your nasal cavity. So have you ever been like drinking water or drinking milk or something and your friend makes you laugh and you end up with water and milk coming out your nose? The reason is because when you're breathing or when you're laughing, the uvula hangs downward. Okay? So when you initially swallowed, the uvula flapped upward and then you started laughing and it came back downward. So some of that milk and so, or water, whatever it may be, splashed upward and ended up in your nasal cavity, and then it ends up, coming out your nose. Okay? So that's where the uvula becomes really important in terms of kind of protecting the nasal cavity from being exposed to any foods or liquids. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Okay.
It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, really cool here. Really.
It almost serves like a epiglottis, right?
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, it basically does similar to what the epiglottis does, just in the reverse direction. Yeah. So
Yeah.
another very good connection. Very good. So remember, we're looking at the epiglottis when we're swallowing. When we swallow, the epiglottis is going to flap downward, and it protects the food protects the windpipes and the airways from being exposed to any of the food. It forces the food into the esophagus. Okay? The uvula does the same thing, but in terms of kind of protecting the upper parts of your nasal or your upper parts of your airways in terms of your nose. Yeah. Cool. Very good. Very good. All right. So that's the mouth there. Okay. So this is just a larger picture that kind of shows all the different parts that we've looked at so far. Okay. Now, also a structure that's going to be found in the mouth are the salivary glands. Okay. So the salivary glands are going to release a fluid called saliva. And so that saliva is going to help to initiate the digestion process. Okay. And so we're going to look at how it's able to do that in a second. Okay. Now, in addition to helping with the breakdown process of food, it's also going to help to kind of lubricate the food and kind of make it a little bit smoother and reduce the friction when you swallow. And then it also helps with dissolving some of the food as well. Okay. So we have 3 pairs of salivary glands. The first pair is called the parotid glands. And so these are kind of inferior and anterior to the ears. Okay, so these are a pretty large set of glands here. The second ones are the submandibular glands. Okay? And so the submandibular glands are or at the base of the tongue, or kind of beneath the base of the tongue, and kind of inferior to the mandible. And then the third ones are the sublingual glands, which are a little bit superior to the submandibular glands. And so these kind of sit right up underneath the tongue. Okay. So all 3 of these glands are going to be producing the saliva. Okay. And then again, that saliva will help to break down some food. And we'll look at exactly how that's going to happen in a second.
I have kind of a stupid question.
No stupid questions. Go ahead.
So I don't know if you've ever like lifted up your tongue before and like squirted out saliva from the bottom. Is that coming from these glands?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So if you ever lift up your tongue and a little bit of kind of, fluid or spit comes out, that's specifically coming from the sublingual glands here.
Yeah. Interesting.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. Cool. Any other questions here? Okay. All right. So the salivary glands, they're going to be regulated by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic parts of the autonomic nervous system. Okay? So that being said, if we're releasing saliva, which division do we think is going to be activated? Is it going to be the sympathetic or the parasympathetic division?
Parasympathetic.
Parasympathetic.
Right, it's going to be the parasympathetic, right? Because the parasympathetic is going to be responsible for your rest and digest functions. Okay? So this is going to be a digestive role. So the parasympathetic division is going to be responsible for helping us release saliva. Okay? Now the flip side of that is if we're ever in a sympathetic situation, so if we're ever, nervous, or if you're exercising, or we're running, or we're kind of embarrassed, or if we're doing like a group presentation or whatever it may be, something that kind of is emotionally arousing, the sympathetic division is going to take over and prevent you from producing any saliva, which is why sometimes if you're ever like super nervous, your mouth gets extremely dry.
Yeah.
That's going to be because the sympathetic division has activated here.
Is
But
that
as far as digestive function, the parasympathetic division is going to be the part that's going to be activated.
would that be an example of dual innervation?
Yes, exactly. That would be an example of dual innervation, right? Where it gets stimulated by both the sympathetic or parasympathetic, but again, only one is going to be active at a particular point in time. Cool. Very good. Okay, so when we're looking at the saliva that gets produced here, it's going to be made up of mostly water, but it's also going to have an enzyme called lysozyme, which we've seen already, that helps to destroy any bacteria that we may have ingested. Okay. And then there's going to be another more digestive enzyme, which is called salivary amylase. Okay. So what salivary amylase does is it helps to break down starch or carbohydrates inside the mouth. Okay. So if you ever like eaten a cracker or eaten like a piece of bread, and you just kind of leave it in your mouth, it starts to dissolve a little bit. The reason it's dissolving is because of this salivary amylase that's found in your saliva that is beginning the breakdown process of those carbohydrates. So that's the first enzyme that we've seen that's going to be involved with digestion. So again, this is going to be with the digestion of carbohydrates or starch. Okay. So if we were to look at a cadaver, this is what our salivary glands would look like. Here we would see our parotid glands, these submandibular glands here. And then if you were to look a little bit deeper underneath the tongue, you would find these sublingual glands. Okay. Now the other part of the mouth that's going to be helpful for the digestion process is the tongue. And so the tongue is going to be made up of skeletal muscle as well as the mucous membrane. And so the muscles of the tongue are going to be really important to help maneuver and shape and kind of move the food around. So those are going to be mainly regulated by the extrinsic muscles, the more outer muscles of the tongue. So as the tongue moves side to side, in and out, kind of front and back, it's going to be able to manipulate and form the food into a little bit of a bolus or a small little chunk of food. Okay. And then it's also going to help to form the floor of the mouth, kind of hold the tongue in place, and it can also help with speech as well. Okay. And then there's going to be some more intrinsic muscles, which are going to be more deep into the tongue. And so those are going to be helping with helping the tongue with producing speech as well as with swallowing as well. Okay. Now at the base of the tongue, there's going to be another fold here that's going to hold the tongue in place, and this is what's called the lingual frenulum. And so the lingual frenulum, again, just kind of limits the movement of the tongue posteriorly and kind of holds it and prevents you from basically swallowing your tongue or falling it or helping it fall or preventing it from falling too far back. So the top of the tongue, or the dorsal part of the tongue, is going to have a couple glands here called the lingual glands. Okay. And so the lingual glands will produce an enzyme called lingual lipase. And so what lingual lipase does is it is an enzyme that is going to help to digest any lipids or triglycerides. So they're going to have to break down triglycerides, and then there's also going to be some taste buds also found on the top of the tongue. So that's the tongue. Okay. And then the last part of the mouth here is the teeth. Okay. And so the teeth are going to be found inside the sockets of the mandible and the maxilla. Okay. And so these are going to help with masticating, or that's just a fancy way of saying chewing your food. Okay. And so as we chew the food and the tongue kind of moves it around, we're going to form that food into a smaller little mass called a bolus. Okay. And so eventually we're going to be able to swallow that bolus. Also within the teeth are going to be found inside the gums. So the gums are going to be what kind of covers the sockets of the mandible and the maxilla, okay, where the teeth are going to be found. And there's going to be a ligament called the periodontal ligament. You don't need to worry too much about that. But the periodontal ligament just holds the teeth in place. It kind of acts as a shock absorber while you're chewing, and basically prevents your teeth from falling out. If you're eating an apple or something like that. Okay. That's the periodontal ligament. Okay. So again, so these are all going to be with the teeth. Okay. Any questions on the mouth before we go forward?
I kind of have a question about like this whole like saliva type of thing. For some weird, I don't know if it's for everyone, but when I feel like I'm going to be sick, I have like an excessive amount of it. What would that be exactly? I didn't know where
that I don't know.
You don't know?
Yeah, that one I don't know. Are you talking about like when you feel like you're about to like vomit or something?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's just like completely like full on watery mouth, and that's when I know I'm like, I gotta go. Like, but I
Yeah.
just know which.
I have no idea why that happens. That one is
Yeah.
going to be one for me to look up.
Okay, perfect, no problem.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But I feel like that's something that happens to everybody too.
Yeah, I didn't want to say
that first sign where it's like, you better run to the bathroom, otherwise you're going to be in some trouble.
Yeah, that's how like I know at least. I'm not speaking for everyone, but I'm like, I gotta go. This is something else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Let me write that one down so I remember to go look into that.
Okay.
Yeah, for me, it's more like citrus fruits and stuff like that. If I look at something that's citrus, then I start like salivating. That is for sure.
That's how I am with like spicy food. I like get super watery mouth.
Yeah.
I feel it.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah. Erica said her daughter's 3 and still has tons of saliva and doing like a baby. Yeah, that babies. The thing with babies is they don't have a whole lot of control over how what's going on with their digestive system, and so when they're 3, usually they start to develop some of that control. But in some cases, some kids it takes a little bit longer for them to figure that out. My nephew, he's about to turn 3. It's the same thing. So he drools like crazy.
That's funny.
Yeah. Any other questions here?
No.
Okay. All right. So all that's happening in the mouth. So we're going to chew our food. We're going to be swallowing our food. And so when the food gets swallowed from the mouth, it's then going to get directed into the stomach. Okay, but before it can get there, the first place it's going to go into is the pharynx. So the pharynx, which we saw when we were looking at the respiratory system, is this kind of funnel-shaped tube that runs from the nasal pharynx, or from the nares, down into the larynx. Okay. And so we got 3 regions. We got the nasopharynx, we got the oropharynx, and then we got the laryngopharynx. But in terms of our digestive system, when we're eating our food, okay, the food is going to be going from the oropharynx down into the laryngopharynx, and then eventually will pass into the esophagus. Okay. The thing about the pharynx, though, is it kind of forks at the end of it. Okay. It's going to be able to divide anteriorly to eventually lead into the larynx, which is going to be your airways, and then it can divide posteriorly, which will lead into the esophagus, which is where we want all of our digestive system, our digestive, structures and foods to go. So the pharynx is going to be made up of mostly skeletal muscle, which is going to allow us to be able to control, our swallowing process. And it's also going to be lined with a mucous membrane. And so that mucus that gets produced inside the pharynx, again, helps to kind of lubricate that pharynx, so that if there's any food coming through, it's able to pass directly through there with very little friction. And the saliva also helps with that process too. And then, like Elijah had mentioned earlier, when we swallow, the epiglottis will flip downward. Okay. And so let me kind of draw this out right here real quick. So when we swallow, the epiglottis flips downward here. Okay. And so when it flips downward, that forces the food to run from the oropharynx directly into the esophagus, okay, and prevents it from entering the larynx. Okay. If the epiglottis doesn't work properly and doesn't close, then we end up with food inside of our airways, and then we start choking, and we don't want that to happen. Okay. So that's what typically will happen there. So ideally that doesn't happen, but it can occasionally. But normally the epiglottis will close and force the food into the esophagus instead of falling into the larynx. Okay. All right. Okay, so as we swallow, food is going to go from the pharynx down into the esophagus. So as we take a look at the esophagus is going to be made up of a mucosa. And so that mucosa is going to have mostly stratified squamous epithelium like we saw previously, as well as some mucus glands. And again, that's going to help with lubricating the food and reducing the friction as food moves through the esophagus. Okay. We're going to have a submucosa, nothing special there. And then we're going to have a muscularis layer. What's interesting about the muscularis is that in the superior third of it, it's going to be made up of pretty much entirely skeletal muscle. Okay. Then once you get to the middle third of it, it's going to be mostly made up of, or it's going to be made up of a combination of skeletal and smooth muscle. Okay. And then once we get to the bottom third, it's going to be made up of entirely smooth muscle. So in different regions of the esophagus, there's going to be a different concentration of skeletal versus smooth muscle. Okay. And so that kind of helps us in terms of, being able to swallow and being able to kind of control our swallowing process there as well, except for when we get to the kind of the middle to latter parts of the esophagus. Okay. And then the outer region is going to be made up of an adventitia. Okay, we're not going to have any serosa around the esophagus. The outer superficial layer is going to be made up of the adventitia, which is just that connective tissue. So
For
that
the
adventitia just helps to, oh yeah, go ahead.
For the exam, are we going to have to know what kind of muscle they're made out of?
For the exam, I would be comfortable with which parts are going to have skeletal muscle, which parts are going to have smooth muscle.
Okay.
Yeah, so the adventitia essentially will just kind of help to anchor the esophagus to kind of the surrounding structures, but that's pretty much all it does. Okay. All right, so as we look at the esophagus is going to be this really, really long tube that's going to move from the pharynx all the way down into the stomach, and it's going to sit behind or posterior to the trachea. Okay. And so its responsibility is to transport the food to the stomach here. Okay. So the way it's going to be doing that is it's going to be running inferiorly, okay, from the laryngopharynx, kind of run inferiorly. It's going to pass through the neck, and then it's going to pass through a hole in the diaphragm called the esophageal hiatus. Okay. And as it passes through there, it's eventually going to lead into the superior portion of the stomach, which we see here. Okay. Now, in order to get food into the top part of the esophagus, into the superior part of the esophagus, we're going to have a sphincter that's called the upper esophageal sphincter. Okay? And that sphincter is going to be made up of skeletal muscle. Okay. So that's what we see over here if we kind of zoom in here. So this is our upper esophageal sphincter. Okay? So in order to open up the upper esophageal sphincter, what needs to happen is the larynx is going to elevate when we swallow. And as it elevates, that causes this sphincter to relax and open up. Okay? So as it opens, that's going to allow the foods to enter the esophagus and then be able to pass through. Okay. So once it enters the esophagus, now we're going to have a bunch of contractions that take place in the esophagus. Okay? And this is the same contraction that we're going to see throughout the rest of the GI tract from here on out. So this series of contractions and relaxations is called peristalsis. Okay. And so in peristalsis, this is where we have contraction on one part of the tube. Okay. And as it contracts, the other part is going to be relaxed so that we're able to move the food from one area to another. Okay. It's almost like kind of like moving the toothpaste from one part to the outside. Okay. You need to squeeze one end, and the other end is not. You're not going to squeeze to enable the toothpaste to come all the way out to the end. Okay. Same thing is going to be happening here. We're going to be contracting the more proximal ends, and then as it moves, okay, it's going to be able to propel the food through the esophagus and again throughout the rest of the GI tract. Okay. So as we have peristalsis of the esophagus, okay, we're going to have contractions here, and that's going to propel the food here. We again see a contraction over here. We see it relaxed over here, and that's going to help to move the food all the way until we reach the lower esophageal sphincter. Okay. So again, here we're going to have lots of mucus glands that are going to help to reduce the friction. Okay. So once we reach the lower esophageal sphincter, there's going to be a little bit of a reflex. And so what's going to happen is the lower esophageal sphincter is going to relax once that food reaches it. As it relaxes, it's going to be able to drop that food right into the stomach. Okay. All right. Any questions on how this whole process works here?
Do they use, since there's a lot of glands that you've been mentioning, is that is there going to be hormones also that trigger any of this process?
Okay, so good question. So we've been looking at a little bit of some glands here. Priscilla, that was you, Priscilla, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So Priscilla's question was, are these all kind of like glands that are going to be releasing hormones? These ones are not. So these ones are not endocrine glands like we were looking at on Monday. These ones are exocrine glands. So all the substances that they're going to be releasing are going to be coming out through tubes onto the surface of these areas. Okay? The endocrine glands that release hormones are going to be releasing those hormones into the blood. Okay? So we're not going to be seeing any endocrine glands here, but we will see a couple later on, and I'll point those out when we get there. Okay, but so far, all we've been looking at are exocrine glands that are not producing any hormones. These are just regular old secretions here.
Okay.
Very good question. Good question.
Is the LES made out of skeletal muscle or smooth muscle, or is it made out of something?
So yeah, it's a good question. So Elijah's question is the lower esophageal sphincter made up of skeletal muscle or smooth muscle? So this is made up of smooth muscle. Okay. So because it's at the lower portions of the esophagus, the lower portions are only made up of smooth muscle. So this sphincter is also only going to be made up of smooth muscle. Yeah. So this one is involuntarily controlled. Okay. Cool. Any other questions here?
Nah.
Okay. Okay. So that brings us to a condition called gastroesophageal reflux disease or heartburn. Okay, so has anyone ever had heartburn before?
Yeah.
Or know someone who's had heartburn? Yeah. Yeah. So typically, so when people have heartburn or GERD or gastroesophageal reflux disease, this is usually because the lower esophageal sphincter doesn't close properly. Okay? And so when we consume some food, okay, the food is going to enter into the stomach. Okay. But if the lower esophageal sphincter doesn't close properly, sometimes the gastric contents in the stomach acid can reflux backward, okay, into the esophagus. Okay. And so because the acid is made up of like hydrochloric acid, which is extremely strong, very, very acidic acid, it almost causes a burning sensation inside the lower esophageal sphincter, or the lower parts of the esophagus and the lower esophageal wall. Okay. It creates a burning sensation that it becomes very painful and sometimes very uncomfortable. And again, that's just due to the stomach acid kind of refluxing backward because the lower esophageal sphincter didn't close and prevent that acid from coming up. Okay. So because it kind of came open, the acid is able to splash upward and then irritate the walls of the esophagus. Okay. So in order to treat it, there's kind of two different treatments you can use. Some people will use antacids, or some people will use kind of histamine 2 blockers. But basically what these do is they'll either reduce the amount of acid that you're producing. Okay? And so if you're not producing as much acid, you're not going to have as much refluxing backward. Okay? Or they'll be able to neutralize the acid. Okay? And so the acid won't become as acidic. So even if it does reflux backward, it won't cause as much irritation, okay? Because it's not as strong of an acid. Okay? So that's how heartburn works.
So does the
Any
sphincter
question
get
on heartburn?
does the sphincter get should I call it like looser as you age? Like with age, does it lose its function so it doesn't close properly, and then maybe with age you get more, like let's say these kind of reflexes? Is that common or not?
Yes. Yeah. So to me, the question is, does this get weaker with age, basically? And so typically, yes, it does get a little bit weaker. So as you get older, you're more likely to have heartburn, just because the sphincter isn't as good as it once was. However, typically it never really, even though it does get weaker, it doesn't usually get weaker to the point that heartburn becomes like an everyday thing or a constant thing for everybody. It happens to some people to the point where you actually receive heartburn for long periods of time. But typically it's usually just for short periods of time where you start to get that heartburn. But typically, yeah, it does happen as you get older.
Also, I've heard that alcohol and like smoking cause the esophagus to relax too, right? Which
Yes. Yeah.
that's why I know like alcohol, you're hungover.
Yes. So a lot of times when people drink alcohol for long periods of time or smoking, they can actually be susceptible to heartburn because kind of the contents of what they're consuming tend to damage the esophagus a little bit and prevent the esophagus from either closing properly or opening properly, or preventing the sphincters from doing what they're supposed to be doing. So yeah, that can be a factor here as well too. Yeah, I get it. All right, cool. All right, so that's heartburn. Okay. So that's in the esophagus. Okay. So the next part, as food enters or moves from the esophagus, it's going to move into the stomach. Okay. So the stomach is just a very large portion of the GI tract, kind of an enlargement of the GI tract. Okay. And so the study of the stomach and all of its structures and functions and any diseases associated with that is what's called gastroenterology. Okay. And so this is the study of the stomach essentially. Okay? And so what the stomach does is it helps to connect the esophagus superior to it to the duodenum, which is inferior to it. And the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. Okay? And so the stomach essentially will act as kind of a holding reservoir for all the food that you're consuming. So just kind of hold it and kind of contain it until you're ready to move it into the small intestine. And it's also going to act as a mixing area too. Okay? And so the stomach is going to be able to secrete lots of gastric juices, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay? And as those gastric juices are produced, they're going to be mixing that with the food. Okay? And so it's going to be able to mix the food with the gastric juices to help with the digestive process as well. Okay? And so every so often, the stomach is going to be squeezing a little bit of food out of it, okay, and into the duodenum, okay, small amounts at a time. And so the stomach is going to be really, really important with the digestive process because it's going to be able to start the digestion of starch or carbohydrates, help with the digestion of proteins and triglycerides as well. Okay. Now, during the whole mixing process, that mixing is, or because it's going to be mixing with all the stomach acid and everything, the semi-solid bolus that we had produced, when we were swallowing initially, is now going to get converted to a liquid. And we'll talk about what that liquid is called in a second. Okay? And then there's going to be very little absorption that's going to take place here. There's going to be some substances that can be absorbed, but typically there's not a ton that's going to get absorbed in the stomach. This is going to be mostly just serving a digestive role here. Okay. All right, so that's the stomach. Okay, so when we take a look at the stomach is going to have 4 overall regions. The first part is called the cardia. Okay? And so the cardia is the location where the esophagus opens up into the stomach. Okay? So that's going to be this region here, where the stomach joins up with the esophagus. Then the next region is the fundus. The fundus is going to be this rounded, more superior portion of the stomach here. That's going to kind of arc over to the left side of the stomach. Then we have the body, which is the main, main portion of the stomach, the large central portion here. And then we're going to have the pyloric part. Okay? So the pyloric part is going to be this end portion of the stomach here. There's going to be different kind of sub-regions to that. Okay? The first one is the pyloric antrum, okay, which kind of connects the body to kind of the pylorus. Okay. Then we have the pyloric canal. Okay. And so the pyloric canal is going to lead into the pylorus, and the pylorus will lead from the stomach into the duodenum. Now, in order to get food from the pylorus into the duodenum, okay, we need to pass that food through a sphincter called the pyloric sphincter. Okay. And so this pyloric sphincter is again going to be made up of smooth muscle, and so that is going to regulate how much food is going to move from the stomach into the small intestine. Okay, so that's okay. All right, now the next portions of the stomach, they're kind of more regions. The first one is called the rugae, and so the rugae are these really large folds inside the stomach's mucosa. And so these ones are actually visible to the naked eye. So if you were to actually open up the stomach, you could actually see the rugae within, within someone's stomach. Then we have a lesser curvature, and so that's going to be the smaller curve of the stomach here. That's going to be the more concave region. And then the more convex, larger curve of the stomach is called the greater curvature. Okay. So that's going to be the more lateral aspect of the stomach. Okay, so if we were to take a look at an endoscopy, if you were to kind of put a camera down into someone's stomach, here you can actually see the rugae just by looking at the stomach here. So you can see all these folds, and again, that helps to increase the surface area, so you're able to release more of those gastric juices to help with the digestive process. This is what the stomach would look like in a cadaver, and again, you can see these folds with the naked eye, and then again, the pyloric sphincter over here, we see the cardia and the main body as well. So when we look at the mucosa of the stomach, we're going to find a bunch of different types of cells, and mostly exocrine glands. So the first type of cell we're going to see are called the mucous neck cells, Okay? And so the mucus neck cells are going to be these guys over here. And so what these mucus neck cells are going to do is they're going to be producing some mucus. Okay? And so that mucus is going to be really important because it's going to be able to protect the lining of the stomach from the acidity of the hydrochloric acid that gets produced from the parietal cells. Okay? So they're going to be able to protect the lining of the stomach from the stomach acid itself. Okay? So the parietal cells are going to be the cells that produce the stomach acid or hydrochloric acid. And the hydrochloric acid is a very, very strong acid. And so again, this is one that helps with the digestive process to some degree. And we'll look at where it becomes really important later. Now, in addition to producing the stomach acid, the parietal cells will also produce something called intrinsic factor, and that just helps with the absorption of vitamin B12.
So when people have stomach ulcers, is that damaged?
Yeah, so in people who have stomach ulcers, it's usually because the parietal cells are either over-secreting acid or they're not secreting enough. But usually it's going to be because they're producing too much. And so because they're producing so much acid and it's not really going anywhere, it basically kind of causes erosions inside the stomach itself. Yeah, that's typically what you definitely don't want to have that happen. So that's part of the reason why when people are bedridden for long periods of time, they'll typically develop ulcers, and it's usually because they're just sitting there and not doing anything. And so because the acid just kind of sits there and is not getting moved, it's not getting kind of directed anywhere, it just kind of sits there and causes erosions through the mucosa of the stomach. Okay. Yeah, very good question. Very good question. Okay, so that's the parietal cells. And then the last type of cell we're going to see is the chief cells. Okay? And so the chief cells are going to be producing two enzymes called pepsinogen and gastric lipase. And we'll take a look at what these do in a second. So with the mucus neck cells producing mucus, we have the parietal cells which produce the hydrochloric acid that makes up your stomach acid. And then we have the chief cells which produce a couple more enzymes, pepsinogen and gastric lipase. So all of the secretions that get produced from the stomach are referred to collectively as gastric juice. Okay, the stomach acid, the enzymes, and the mucus, those all make up your gastric juice. Okay. So we have an additional cell here called G cells. Okay. And so G cells, which are found inside the antrum, will secrete a hormone called gastrin. Okay. And so what gastrin does, it helps to stimulate the growth of the gastric glands and help with increasing the secretion of the gastric juice. Okay, so in addition to that, we also see the submucosa. Nothing special about the submucosa. However, when we get to the muscularis, things are going to get a little bit different here. Okay. So the muscularis, instead of having two layers like we saw previously, the muscularis inside the stomach is going to have 3 layers. Okay. And so the reason for having 3 layers is it helps to ensure that you're going to be able to cause more stronger contractions inside the stomach to help more effectively churn and mix the food, okay, and be able to kind of break down the food as well. So having an extra layer helps to also kind of mechanically break down the food and then churn it up and kind of digest it as well. Okay. So instead of having just kind of a longitudinal layer and one middle layer, you'll also have a more inner oblique layer of smooth muscle as well. Okay. And then again, you have the serosa. Again, nothing special with that. Okay, so that's that. Okay, now, like we talked about, the stomach's main role is with digestion. Okay? Very little absorption is going to be taking place inside the stomach. Okay? In order for digestion to take place, we're going to need 2 enzymes. The first one is pepsin. Okay? And so pepsin is the active form of pepsinogen. Okay? So that pepsinogen that we released from the chief cells can't really do anything on its own. Okay? In order to get activated, it needs to be exposed to some acid or an acidic environment. Okay? So when that pepsinogen comes into contact with the stomach acid, then it kind of takes the active form called pepsin. And so from there, pepsin will be able to degrade proteins into smaller individual peptides that we can then be able to digest. Okay. So pepsin helps to digest proteins into smaller peptides. Okay. The other hormone is gastric lipase. And so gastric lipase is what helps to break down lipids and fats. Okay. So they break it down into smaller components, into smaller fatty acids and monoglycerides. And then again, your gut body is going to be able to absorb that later on. Okay. However, gastric lipase is not, doesn't serve that much of a role, but it does kind of assist here. But it serves kind of a more limited role inside the stomach. Okay. All right, any questions on the stomach before we go forward?
No.
Okay, cool. Okay, so now in order to move the food from the stomach into the small intestine, into the duodenum, we're going to need some more peristaltic contractions. And so what's going to happen here is our stomach is going to contract. It's going to have those peristalsis waves going through it, okay? And they're going to get stronger and stronger as they reach the antrum. Okay? And so that's what we call propulsion. Okay? Propulsion meaning moving the food from the top of the stomach down towards the end of the stomach or the antrum. Okay? However, if the food particles are not broken down into small enough pieces, okay, they're not going to be able to pass through the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter is a very small area. Okay? So if the food particles are too big, okay, they're not going to be able to fit through. Okay? And so what's going to happen in order to kind of help break it down further is you're going to have what's called retropulsion or retrograde peristalsis, where you have peristalsis happening but in the reverse direction. Okay? So instead of having peristalsis going down towards the antrum, you have retropulsion where you move it backwards. Okay, so that way you can kind of mix it some more with some of the gastric juices, and then the stomach acid can kind of mix with it a little bit more and break it down into smaller particles, and then you basically try again with peristalsis. Okay. So it's kind of this kind of back and forth movement of peristalsis. You squeeze a little bit out. Okay. If it's too big, you do kind of retropulsion, break it down some more, and then try again with propulsion again, and kind of go back and forth until you ultimately get rid of all the food there.
Wow, that's like a backup plan.
Yeah, essentially the backup plan. So it always has a way of being able to digest something, typically. Yeah. So as the food starts to mix with as our bolus of food starts to mix with the gastric juices, okay, the stomach acid and the enzymes and everything else that gets secreted here, okay, the food is going to be mixing with all of those different juices, and it's going to eventually become what's called a soupy liquid called chyme. Okay. So our chyme is now kind of a soupy liquid that's going to be our food that gets mixed with our gastric juices. And again, the food particles are going to be found within that chyme. Okay. So the process of moving some of those food particles from the stomach into the duodenum is what's called gastric emptying. Okay. And again, it has to happen only if the food particles are small enough to pass through the pyloric sphincter. Okay. If not, again, you go through retropulsion, and you try to break things down a little bit further within your chyme, and then again, go through that whole process over and over again, until you ultimately empty the stomach. Okay, so that's how the stomach works. And that's how we're gonna move molecules in, or move different food particles into the small intestine. Okay, so now that brings us to kind of vomiting. Okay, so I think Danielle had brought this up earlier. So vomiting is a process that none of us really like, and it's basically what happens when we have these very strong, very forceful contractions from the upper GI tract. Okay? And so what happens is we end up moving because we have lots of contractions taking place in the stomach and to an extent the small intestine. Very strong contractions that push those gastric contents up through our esophagus and out through the mouth. Okay? And so this is typically going to be caused by any irritation that takes place inside the stomach, or any kind of distension if the stomach stretches up too much. Okay, that can cause them vomiting as well. Okay. But the main reason is going to be due to likely some irritation inside the stomach or the rest of the GI tract. Okay. So the way this works is whenever there's some irritation, there's going to be some nerve impulses, and those nerve impulses are going to run from the stomach to a center inside the medulla called the vomiting center. Okay. So the medulla has a vomiting center that's going to take in those impulses from the stomach. Okay. From there, the medulla is going to say, okay, we have something here that shouldn't be here. There's something that's irritating us, something that's causing us some discomfort. We need to get rid of it. Okay. And so what it's going to do is it's going to send lots of motor impulses down to the upper parts of the GI tract, namely the stomach, and to a lesser extent, the small intestine, okay, and cause a very, very strong contraction. Okay. In addition to that, it's also going to be causing the diaphragm to contract, and the abdominal muscles to contract. And so all of those contractions create a ton of pressure that ultimately push all of those gastric contents out of the mouth, okay, up through those esophageal sphincters. Okay. And so this is kind of basically what happens when we're throwing up and kind of struggling through that. And so it's also part of the reason why when you're vomiting, it tends to be kind of a little bit hard to breathe. That's because, again, the diaphragm and the abdominal muscles are constantly contracting because of these nerve impulses coming from the medulla. And so if we have any prolonged vomiting for long periods of time, that becomes very dangerous because it leads to loss of stomach acid. And if you're losing too much acid, that causes what's called alkalosis, which is where you have a higher than normal blood pH. And if that happens, that can kind of throw all the rest of your body systems out of whack. It can lead to dehydration. And because you're losing so much acid through the mouth, it can cause some damage to the esophagus as well as to the teeth too. Okay. So this is no fun. It sucks. And if it happens for long periods of time, it can make things pretty serious too. All right. Any questions here?
No.
Okay. All right, cool. So question here. So which of the following identifies the region indicated in the figure? Okay, so which region are we looking at here? Is this the body, the cardia, the fundus, the pyloric canal, or the pyloric antrum?
It's going to be
The cardia.
Yes, B is correct. This is the cardia, right? So the cardia, that's going to be the location where the esophagus is going to join up with the stomach. Right? If we was looking at this region over here, what would this region be?
The body.
Right, here would be looking at the body.
Yeah.
If you're looking at this curved part up here,
Are you
what would this be?
talking or like?
It's the fundus part.
Right, so this would be the fundus.
Oh, okay, I see.
And then the end of it here, we would have the pylorus.
Pylorus.
Yeah. Cool. All right, good. Okay. That's going to lead us into the small intestine. Okay. But before we can get to the small intestine, we kind of have to talk about the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder, because the small intestine's activity is dependent on the pancreas, the liver, and the gallbladder. Okay. It cannot really work without those three organs. Okay. So we're going to start by taking a look at the pancreas. And so the pancreas is going to be a retroperitoneal organ, and it's going to sit sit posterior to the stomach. Okay. And so the pancreas actually is able to connect to the duodenum of the small intestine using two different ducts here. Okay. So that's our pancreas here. Kind of is almost shaped like a little fish here. And so the first duct is called the pancreatic duct. And so the pancreatic duct is this very long duct that runs the length of the pancreas, and it will ultimately join up with the common bile duct. And we'll look at what the common bile duct is in a little bit. Okay. Here's our common bile duct right here. Okay. And so as they join together, they're going to form, they're going to kind of fuse together, and they're going to form the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Okay. So here, if we were to kind of zoom in, here we would see the pancreatic duct joining with the common bile duct. As they join together, they're going to form the hepatopancreatic ampulla. Okay. And so this hepatopancreatic ampulla is going to open up directly into the duodenum of your small intestine. So that's one of the first openings from the pancreas into the duodenum. Okay. The second one is the accessory duct. Okay. So the accessory duct kind of branches off of the pancreatic duct, and it'll open directly into the duodenum.
Okay.
So those are those ducts there. Okay. So as we look at the pancreas, we saw the pancreas on Monday, where we saw it having an endocrine function in terms of being able to secrete the hormones glucagon and insulin in response to our blood calcium levels. Those are found in the pancreatic islets, which you see over here. Okay. But we also saw that the pancreas has an exocrine function as well. Okay? And so that exocrine function is going to be used in the digestive, in its digestive role. Okay? So instead of having the pancreatic islet secreting hormones, there's also going to be another cluster of cells, cluster of exocrine cells here, called the pancreatic acini. Okay? And so the pancreatic acini are these clusters of epithelial cells which are going to secrete our pancreatic juices. Okay? And so the pancreatic juice So our acini are going to be over here, okay? These outer clusters. Okay? So these pancreatic acini are going to be able to secrete lots of digestive enzymes through the ducts that we were looking at just now, okay? As well as some fluid. Okay? And then the pancreatic juice will then again be able to enter into the duodenum. So this is where the pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine functions. Okay? Endocrine in terms of the hormones, exocrine in terms of the pancreatic enzymes that are going to assist with digestion. Okay, so the pancreatic juice that gets released from the pancreas is going to be made up of water, it's going to be made up of salt, and it's going to be made up of some alkaline fluid here, okay, some sodium bicarbonate. Okay? The reason we're going to be secreting an alkaline fluid is because when the chyme gets into the intestines, there's going to be lots of acid in it, okay? And we don't want that acid to start to digest and start to break down the small intestine. Okay? So what this alkaline fluid is going to do is it's going to kind of balance out the acid and kind of buffer the acid inside the chyme so that we don't end up digesting our small intestine instead of the food itself. Okay? So in addition to all of those different things, it's also going to be secreting a bunch of enzymes. Okay? And so the first enzyme that we're going to see is pancreatic amylase, which is a much more potent version of the salivary amylase that we saw previously. And so pancreatic amylase helps to digest starch or other carbohydrates into smaller components that we can then be able to digest, okay, and absorb. Okay. In addition to that, it's also going to be producing a lot of enzymes that help to degrade protein. So these enzymes are trypsin, chymotrypsin, carboxypeptidase, and elastase. Okay, so all four of those help to break down protein. Okay. And then the pancreatic lipase helps to break down lipids. Okay, so this is the more potent version of the gastric lipase that we saw in the stomach. Okay. So this helps to break down our lipids and fats. Okay. So the pancreas is really, really important because basically all of the foods that we are going to be eating, okay, are going to be degraded by enzymes created by the pancreas. If the pancreas isn't working properly, or the exocrine or the exocrine functions of the pancreas aren't working right, it's going to be very, very difficult for us to be able to digest anything. So we need all these enzymes to help with the digestive process. Okay. So they're going to be secreting their enzymes, releasing them into their ducts, and then from there, the ducts are going to deposit those enzymes into the small intestine, okay, into the duodenum. Okay, before we go forward, any questions on the pancreas?
No.
Okay. All right. So then the next one is the liver. Okay? And so the liver is an organ that's going to help to produce bile. Okay? So the liver is going to be this very, very large structure, this very large organ here, and that's what we see over here. And it's going to be able to produce bile. And we'll talk about what bile does in a little bit. Okay? Just keep that in mind. It produces bile. Okay? So when we look at the liver, it's going to be divided up into a few lobes. Firstly, it's going to be divided up into the right and left lobes by the falciform ligament, okay, which we see here. As here's going to be our left lobe and then our right lobe here. Okay. That falciform ligament is again going to kind of hold the liver inside the abdominal cavity. Okay. In addition to that, we're also going to find a couple of other lobes. We're going to find a caudate lobe and then a quadrate lobe. Don't worry too much about those, but just know there's extra lobes there. And then we're going to find the ligamentum teres. Okay. So the ligamentum teres is just an extension of the falciform ligament. That's going to be the free end of it. Okay. And so the ligamentum teres, or also called the round ligament, will attach the liver directly to the umbilicus, or your belly button. Okay. And then we're also going to see some coronary ligaments, which just attach the liver to the diaphragm. And again, kind of holds it in place. So the liver is a very, very strong or very, very large organ that needs to be held up by multiple different ligaments to kind of hold it in place. So the liver is going to be responsible for producing bile. And then we're also going to have another structure that sits up underneath it. This organ is called the gallbladder, which we see over here. And so the gallbladder is going to be kind of a more pear-shaped organ that sits on the inferior surface of the liver. Okay? And so what it's going to be doing is it's going to be able to store bile. Okay? So the liver will produce bile, and the gallbladder will be able to store it. Okay? And so when we take a look at the gallbladder, there's going to be a fundus part. You don't worry too much about these regions here. There's going to be a fundus part that's going to be kind of the inferior portion. And then there's going to be a neck that's going to connect to a couple of ducts. So what is the liver and the gallbladder? Okay, liver producing bile, and then the gallbladder, which stores the bile.
Question.
Okay, so this is what it would look like in the cadavers. And so again, you can see it's a very large organ, and you would see the gallbladder, which takes on a greenish color because of the bile that it stores, sitting right up underneath it on the inferior surface. Okay, so when we take a look at the liver, specifically the cells of the liver, that bile is going to be produced in the bile cells called, the liver cells called hepatocytes. Okay. So these hepatocytes are anywhere from 5 to 12-sided cells, and they're going to be responsible for producing and secreting the bile. Okay. They also do a bunch of other functions, which we'll talk about later, but just keep in mind they're going to be responsible for producing the bile. Now, the bile cannot just stay in the liver. It has to be able to get out of the liver. Okay. So we're going to go through the pathway of how bile is going to exit out of the liver. And this is one that I do want you to be comfortable with for the final exam as well. Okay. So the bile is going to get moved from the hepatocytes into a series of ducts called the bile canaliculi. Okay. And so these canaliculi are just kind of sit in between individual hepatocytes, and they're going to collect the bile there. Those bile canaliculi are going to kind of join together, and they're going to end up forming these bile ducts. Okay. Then we're going to have these bile ducts, and those bile ducts are going to merge together to form the right and left hepatic ducts. Those right and left hepatic ducts are going to exit out of the liver and then join together and form the common hepatic duct. Okay. So when you think of the word hepatic, think liver. Okay. Hepatic means liver. Okay. So the common hepatic duct will exit out of the liver and take the bile out of the liver here. Okay. From there, the common hepatic duct will join up with a cystic duct that leads to the gallbladder. Okay. Join up with the cystic duct to form the common bile duct. Okay. This common bile duct will then kind of pass more inferiorly until it reaches the small intestine. Okay. And then from there, it'll drop off that bile into the small intestine. Okay. Now, when the bile gets, when the small intestine is empty, so when you're like in between a meal, okay, for example, there's going to be a sphincter that's going to kind of regulate the opening between the common bile duct and the small intestine. Okay. So when there's nothing in the small intestine, okay, that sphincter is going to be closed. Okay. And so when it closes up, the bile is going to have nowhere to go. And so it's just basically just going to back up into the common bile duct, okay, and eventually into the cystic duct to eventually get stored here inside the gallbladder. And I'll show you a more detailed picture of that in a second. But basically, this is what's going to be going on. Okay, so we're going to have our hepatocytes producing the liver, producing the bile, and the bile is going to get moved into the bile canaliculi. The bile canaliculi are going to join together to form the bile ducts. The bile ducts are then going to join together to form the right and left hepatic ducts. Those right and left hepatic ducts will join to form the common hepatic duct. The common hepatic duct will join with the cystic duct to form the common bile duct. And then from there, that'll lead into the small intestine. If the sphincter that regulates the small intestine is closed, the bile backs up through the common bile duct into the cystic duct, and then stores the bile inside the gallbladder. Okay. Any questions on this process here? Okay, so Elizabeth's question is, when the gallbladder gets removed, where does the bile get stored? Good question, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So hang on to that question, and don't let me forget about it if I pass it through. But yeah, we'll get to that in a little bit. Any other questions?
What about what happens when you produce too much bile? Like sometimes people, I know people like will throw up bile.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm saying.
Yeah. So Valerie's question is, what happens if you produce too much bile? Okay, so if you produce too much bile, it causes a little bit of irritation inside the small intestine. Okay. And so In some cases, it's usually, actually, let me backtrack. It's usually okay if you're producing large amounts of bile because it gets stored inside the gallbladder. However, if you're not releasing enough of it, it creates a little bit of kind of distension within the gallbladder. So it can cause the gallbladder to get inflamed. If you're just releasing too much bile into the small intestine, that can irritate the small intestine itself. If there's, it can just kind of irritate it, and that can lead to the vomiting reflexes that we see, like we saw earlier. So in some cases it causes irritation. In some cases it causes kind of more inflammation of the gallbladder itself. Yeah, good question.
Then
Any other questions?
yeah, I have one. Is that sphincter a smooth muscle then? I'm guessing it is, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that sphincter is also a smooth muscle. Yeah, and so we'll talk about what that sphincter is in a little bit too. All right. Any other questions? So again, this is one pathway I do want you to be comfortable with for the exam as well. Okay. All righty, so that's that. Okay, so it's just kind of a little schematic that kind of shows you where the bile is going to be moving. Again, left hepatic duct joins with the right hepatic duct to form the common hepatic duct, forms the common bile duct, and then as it joins with the cystic duct, and then pass through the sphincter into the duodenum. Okay. And then if the sphincter is closed, it backs up into the common bile duct, into the cystic duct, and gets stored inside the gallbladder. Okay, so again, we'll talk about what that bile does in just a second. So when we, at this slide, I don't want you to, don't worry about writing down this slide here. But basically what happens in the liver is the liver is going to have lots of these what's called hepatic sinusoids, or these very extensive blood capillaries that are going to take oxygenated blood to the liver, but they're also going to take any deoxygenated nutrient-rich blood from the liver to the liver, I should say. Okay. So if we're absorbing any nutrients from our intestines, those nutrients are going to get deposited into the blood. Okay. The nutrient-rich blood is then going to take those nutrients to the liver using the hepatic sinusoids. Okay. So those hepatic sinusoids are eventually going to kind of lead into all of these hepatic lobules, and they'll converge into what's called a central vein. Okay. And then from there, the central veins will then deliver that blood into the hepatic veins, which will then drain into the inferior vena cava, and then go throughout the rest of your body circulation from there. But that's how the liver is going to come into contact with all of those nutrients. Okay. So those nutrients that are going to be kind of reaching the liver are going to be coming through the hepatic portal vein. Okay? So that hepatic portal vein will deliver all those nutrients and any drugs or microbes or toxins into the hepatic sinusoids of the liver. And then from there into the central vein, the hepatic vein, inferior vena cava, and then the right atrium of the heart. Okay. So when we typically study the liver is usually studied in kind of lobules. And so these lobules, these hepatic lobules, are these usually hexagonal kind of shaped units of hepatocytes. And so in the middle of each hepatic lobule is a central vein. Okay. And again, that's going to be where all the sinusoids are going to be converging into. And so we're going to have our central vein there, as well as 3 portal triads at 3 of our corners. Okay. The portal triads are going to contain a bile duct. Okay. We're going to contain a branch of the hepatic artery, as well as a branch of the hepatic portal vein. Okay. And again, that hepatic portal vein is going to be delivering that nutrient-rich blood into the hepatic sinusoids and into the liver from here. Okay. All right. So that's what we consider a hepatic lobule. Okay. So the bile that we just talked about. Okay. The bile, its job is to emulsify fats. Okay. That's just a fancy way of saying it helps to take these large lipid molecules, the large fat molecules or globules, and break them down into smaller fat droplets so that we can then absorb them a lot easier. Okay. So a bile that we produce from the liver and the bile that gets stored in the gallbladder is going to be useful for helping us to break down lipids and fats, okay, or emulsify fats. Okay. So that's going to be where they become really, really important. Okay. Now, like we talked about before, if there's no food, so if we're in between meals, right? If we, let's say we ate our steak or we ate our, bread or pasta or whatever it may be at like 8 o'clock at night, and then we wake up the next morning, it's 8 o'clock, we haven't eaten in a long period of time, okay, there's not going to be any food in our small intestine. Okay? So during that period, okay, the sphincter of Oddi, which is the opening at the bile duct, that sphincter of Oddi is going to be closed. Okay? And the reason it's going to be closed is it's not going to have any reason to have this duct open. Okay? We're not going to want to just deliver bile into the duodenum, even though when there's no food in there. Okay? It's not going to serve a purpose. It's going to be useless. Okay? So that's one way where the body wants to be as efficient as possible. Okay? If there's no food there, it doesn't want to be delivering bile into the duodenum if there's nothing there. Okay? So instead, what it's going to be doing is it's going to close up the sphincter of Oddi. And when it closes, it causes the bile to back up into the common bile duct, into the cystic duct, and eventually get stored inside the gallbladder. So again, that's going to happen when there's no food inside the small intestine. Okay? So that's kind of where the body kind of gets really beautifully built in terms of its efficiency. Okay? Now, when we are eating, when we have eaten a meal, what's going to happen is some of the fatty acids and the amino acids that are inside our chyme, inside our duodenum, are going to trigger a hormone to get released called cholecystokinin, or CCK. Okay. So what cholecystokinin does is it causes contraction of the gallbladder walls. Okay. And so when the gallbladder contracts, it's going to squeeze that bile out of the gallbladder down into the cystic duct, through the common bile duct, and then to the sphincter of Oddi. Okay. At the same time that's going to happen, the CCK also causes the sphincter of Oddi to relax. Okay. And as it relaxes, it opens up and allows the bile to flow freely into the duodenum and then be able to break down those fats that may be present there. Okay. So this is one that I also do want you to be comfortable with. This is one process I do want you to be comfortable with. So again, when there's no meals, when there's no food inside the duodenum, the sphincter of Oddi is going to be closed, and the bile is going to back up to the common bile duct and into the cystic duct and into the liver. Because again, you don't want to be sending bile to somewhere where the bile is not going to be efficient or not going to be doing anything, okay? Or not going to be useful. And then when you are ready to use the bile, when you have food inside your duodenum, okay, you're going to release that bile, okay, through using CCK. Okay, so cholecystokinin is going to cause the gallbladder to contract. As it contracts, it's going to squeeze that bile through the cystic duct, into the common bile duct, and through the sphincter of Oddi. So the bile can now act inside the duodenum. Okay. So this is one area where it kind of blows my mind just how beautifully built the body is in terms of how it's able to be as efficient as possible in terms of regulating when bile gets released.
Yeah.
Any questions on this process?
No.
Okay. Does this make sense? Let's start.
Yeah. It does.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. Okay. So in addition to kind of producing bile, the liver is also able to do a wide range of other functions. One of them, in terms of kind of with the digestive system, is with carbohydrate metabolism. And so this kind of goes back to what we were looking at on Monday. And so what happens is when we're in between meals, when we haven't eaten for a long period of time, the liver is able to store a molecule called glycogen. Okay? And so glycogen is kind of the storage form of glucose. Okay? And so if our blood glucose levels get too low, then our pancreas is going to start releasing that hormone glucagon. Okay? And so what glucagon does is it takes that glycogen, which we see over here. It's going to take that glycogen and break it down into individual glucose molecules, and then be able to take that glucose and drop it off into the blood to raise our blood glucose back up to an appropriate level, its normal set point. Okay. So again, that's going to be regulated by the hormone glucagon from the pancreas. Okay. The flip side of that is when we have eaten a meal, okay, when we're kind of, let me backtrack. So this is going to happen in the fasted state. Again, when you haven't eaten for a long period of time, okay, when you need your blood glucose levels to get back up. Okay. Now, when we are eating a meal, okay, our blood glucose levels are naturally going to increase. Okay? And again, we don't want our blood glucose levels to stay too high for too long of a period. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to be able to take that extra glucose and bring it back to the liver. Okay. So the extra glucose is going to, inside of our blood, is going to get delivered back to the liver so that we can then store it as glycogen. So that if we're ever in a period where we don't have enough glucose, we can then just take that glycogen and then use it to bring our blood glucose levels back up. Okay. So when we're in the fed state, when we have eaten eaten recently, okay, our glucose is going to get moved from the blood and into the liver and gets stored as glycogen. And we're going to kind of go back and forth between these two processes when we're in the fed state and the fasted state. Okay. So this process gets regulated by the hormone insulin that comes from the pancreas as well. Okay. So this is kind of where our glycogen kind of goes back and forth between glucose. Okay. So when we haven't eaten a meal for a long period of time, we're going to, or I guess let me start from the beginning. When we have eaten a meal, okay, we're going to take our glucose, convert it into glycogen, okay, and then when we go through periods of time where we haven't eaten, we're going to break down that glycogen that we stored into individual glucose molecules to bring our blood glucose back up to an appropriate level. Okay. So that's going to be where we're going to be able to regulate our carbohydrate metabolism.
I have a question, George.
Yeah.
When it goes from glucose to the liver, is that glycolysis from the last lecture?
When it goes from, so glycolysis is basically where we're breaking down glucose. So yes, yeah, essentially. So this can be used for glycolysis. So basically what will happen is when you're undergoing glycolysis, when you need to produce more ATP or more energy, one of the things that your body is going to be able to do is it's going to start with glycogen. Okay? It's going to take that glycogen and it's going to break it down into individual glucose molecules. Okay? Once you break it down into those glucose molecules, then you can use that glucose to then help you produce ATP. Okay? So that's going to be where you undergo glycolysis specifically there. Good questions. Any other questions here? Okay. All right. So in addition to carbohydrate metabolism, the liver is also going to be helpful with lipid metabolism as well in terms of being able to store and break down fat, as well as being able to produce cholesterol, as well as some lipoproteins too. Okay. It's also going to help with protein metabolism in terms of helping you to build up proteins from different amino acids from your diet or break down proteins if you are need some extra energy. It can help with processing different drugs and hormones. So drugs being, either, like actual like drugs, or it could be, different medicines or things like that. And then also helping with regulating hormones and processing and inactivating hormones. Okay. In some cases, it can help with excreting bilirubin, which is a molecule that gets released from the red blood cells. And so that bilirubin gets deposited into the bile. It can help with producing bile salts, as you saw previously. It's going to store glycogen, like we saw earlier, as well as being able to store various vitamins and minerals. It's going to be able to break down red blood cells, white blood cells, and bacteria, and then activate vitamin D. Okay. So as you can see, the liver does a whole lot of different functions in addition to just working with the digestive system. Okay. So the liver is going to be one of the most important organs in the body, which I guess is kind of why it's kind of aptly named the liver, because it really does help you kind of live.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So gallstones. Okay. So gallstones is a very kind of painful condition, or a very kind of painful thing that can develop for a couple of reasons. Okay. Number one is they can develop if we are not producing enough bile salts in the bile that we're making. Okay. Or it can happen if we're producing too much cholesterol in the bile. Okay. And so what can happen is that extra cholesterol can crystallize into some gallstones. Okay. And so these gallstones can become pretty problematic because what happens is they begin to cause obstructions either inside the cystic duct or inside the gallbladder, or sorry, the common bile duct. Okay. If that happens, okay, now our bile has no way of getting from the gallbladder into the duodenum, and in some cases it may even block the common bile ducts. Mm-hmm. And so this can cause some significant issues, and you're not going to be able to digest any fat. Okay? And this becomes a very painful condition that people begin to develop. Okay? So in order to treat someone who has gallstones, the kind of gold standard way to kind of deal with this is to remove the gallbladder altogether. Okay? And so when you remove the gallbladder, that's what we call a cholecystectomy. And so you remove the gallbladder. And so the problem with that is you're no longer able to produce or store bile. Okay? You can still produce the bile because your liver is still going to be present, but you have no way of storing it. Okay? And so if you don't have any way of storing it, now it becomes a little bit problematic in terms of your efficiency with your use of bile. Okay? And so because you can't use bile effectively or as effectively as you once could, patients who have cholecystectomies have to pretty much cut down on fats in their diets, okay? Because again, it's going to be a little bit harder for them to be able to digest it. Okay? So that brings us to Elizabeth's question. So Elizabeth had asked, when the gallbladder gets removed, where does the bile get stored? Okay? And so this is kind of what happens here. So the gallbladder because the gallbladder gets removed, there's no way to store it. Okay? And so the liver can produce the bile. Okay? And so the bile will typically just kind of run through the common bile duct and kind of directly enter the small intestine. The problem with that is if you're kind of overproducing bile too much, if you're kind of overproducing it, it can cause the small intestine to become a little bit irritable or irritated. And so that's kind of where we get some of that vomiting sensations in with people kind of vomiting bile. And so it becomes a very tricky condition to balance out in terms of how to deal with the bile that gets released from the liver. Yeah. So it kind of essentially just gets kind of stored here until you have food that causes the opening of the sphincter of Oddi to allow that bile to come through. Good question. So any questions on gallstones?
No.
No, we're good.
Okay. All right, so question here. So in the figure shown, what structure is indicated? Okay. So here, are we looking at the right hepatic duct, the common bile duct, the cystic duct, the common bile duct, or the hepatopancreatic ampulla?
It's going to be C, cystic duct.
Did I hear C? Do we agree with C? Do we disagree? What do you think?
Agree.
Yes, that would be the cystic duct. Right. So the cystic duct, that's going to be where bile is going to be moving from the gallbladder. Okay. Perfect. Or moving to or from the gallbladder. All right. So that leads us into the small intestine. So again, the small intestine cannot, do anything that it does without the action of the gallbladder, the liver, and the pancreas. Okay. So the small intestine is going to be the site of the majority of the digestion and absorption. And again, that's going to be because all the pancreatic juices, as well as the bile, are going to be getting deposited into the small intestine to begin that digestive process. Okay. Now, the other thing that's going to be important here is that most of the absorption in the body is going to be taking place here as well. Okay. And so the reason there's going to be lots of absorption taking place is because we have a very, very long tube. The small intestine is a very long tube. It's got lots of folds in it, lots of villi, as well as lots of microvilli. Okay? And all of that helps to maximize the surface area inside the small intestine. Okay? And so with a very large surface area, that helps to kind of maximize the amount of nutrients that you're going to be able to absorb. Okay? So when we take a look at the small intestine, it pretty much ranges from the pyloric sphincter of the stomach, which we see up here, all the way down to the large intestine. And so this whole structure here is about 10 feet long, kind of all coiled up, again, packed within your abdominal cavity. So the small intestine is kind of divided up into 3 regions. The first region is the duodenum, which is kind of the first portion, about 10 inches long. And so that is going to kind of be more retroperitoneal. Okay. The middle region is called the jejunum. Okay. That's going to be the second part of the small intestine. And then the last portion is the ileum. So the ileum is the last and the longest portion, and that will open up directly into the large intestine through a valve or a sphincter called the ileocecal sphincter, or the ileocecal valve.
George?
So when we take a look at this, oh yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
So ileum and like the ileum sound really way too similar.
The ileum and the ileum, yes. So yeah, that's where we have two structures.
Okay.
Basically, same name with a 1-letter difference. Yeah, so we got the ileum that makes up your hip bones, and then we got the ileum of your small intestine.
Oh, that's so confusing. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So the ileum with your hip bone is spelled with ILI, ileum of the small intestine is ILE. Yeah. So I don't know who named him, but whoever named him needs to be fired. But that's just me. Cool. Okay, so that's the small intestine. Okay, so when we look at the mucosa of the small intestine, we're going to find a bunch of absorptive cells. Okay? And so these are the cells that are going to be responsible for absorbing all those nutrients that we're consuming. Okay? So what helps with the absorptive cells is that they're going to be making up the villi of the small intestine. Okay? But each of these absorptive cells will have its own microvilli. Okay? And so what the microvilli do is they help to increase the surface area to make sure that you're able to absorb as many of those nutrients as possible. Okay? So those are the absorptive cells. In addition to that, we'll also have the goblet cells. And so the goblet cells will help to secrete some mucus. And so that will be kind of helpful to help kind of negate some of the acidity from the chyme. We're going to have some Paneth cells. And so the Paneth cells secrete lysozyme, which we saw earlier, which in terms of degrading and destroying any bacteria or pathogens that we may have consumed. And then we have some intestinal glands, which will produce any intestinal juice. And then we have enteroendocrine cells, which will secrete some hormones, okay? Namely cholecystokinin. All right, so those are some of the mucosa. Okay. So when we take a look at those enteroendocrine cells, again, we got two major types. The first cells are the S cells, which is the secretin. And so it helps to trigger the secretion of kind of the pancreatic juices as well as the bile and everything like that. And then we have the CCK cells, which are a type of enteroendocrine cells. And so the CCK cells inside the small intestine will release that hormone CCK, cholecystokinin. And again, that's going to help to trigger the release of bile from the small intestine and then the opening of the sphincter of Oddi when they come into contact with fatty acids and amino acids. Okay. In addition to that, we'll also find some Peyer's patches. So these are just lymphatic nodules that help to destroy any bacteria that we may have ingested. We will also have some Brunner's glands, which will produce some alkaline mucus. And so those, that mucus will help to kind of neutralize any gastric acid from the chyme. And then the muscularis and the serosa, nothing really special there. The muscularis is going to have two layers, just like we saw everywhere else except for the stomach. And then the serosa will only be present around the jejunum and the ileum, but not the duodenum. Okay, so the duodenum is just going to have the adventitia surrounding it. Okay, that is that. Okay, so like we saw, the major function of the small intestine is to help with digestion. And most of the digestion is going to take place here. Okay? So in order to do so, it's going to be releasing lots of intestinal juice. Okay? That intestinal juice is going to be made up of some alkaline fluid, made up of that sodium bicarbonate. It's going to be made up of water as well as some mucus. And so the intestinal juice, along with the pancreatic juice, is going to help with the absorption process, when they're being exposed to chyme. Now, in addition to the intestinal juice, we'll also find some extra enzymes inside the small intestine. Okay, these ones you don't need to worry about too much, but we'll have these enzymes called brush border enzymes. And so these brush border enzymes, again, help with further degrading these nutrients into smaller components. So for example, we have alpha dextrinase, maltase, sucrase, lactase, and those are responsible for helping to digest various types of carbohydrates. And then we have some peptidases, like aminopeptidases and dipeptidases, which help to digest any proteins. Okay? And again, they're going to be broken up into smaller components that can then be absorbed by the intestines. Okay. Now, these brush border enzymes are going to be extremely important when it comes to a particular condition called lactose intolerance. Okay? So, is anyone like me who is lactose intolerant? Am I alone here? Yeah, okay, so we got a few people who are lactose intolerant. Okay. So basically what should happen normally is we should have an enzyme called lactase. Okay. And so lactase is an enzyme that helps to break down lactose, which is a disaccharide, a type of carbohydrate, okay. Break down lactose into glucose and galactose that we can then absorb through the small intestine. Okay. That's what should happen. when we consume lactose, anything with milk. Okay. However, people who are lactose intolerant do not produce that enzyme. They don't produce lactase. Okay. And so instead, okay, because they're not able to produce that lactase gets degraded by some bacteria, okay, the bacteria inside of our small intestines. Okay. So before we get there, so for those of you guys who are lactose intolerant, what are some symptoms that you have when you eat milk or ice cream or dairy?
Diarrhea.
What are some symptoms you see? What was it?
Bloated.
Isn't it diarrhea?
So bloating, diarrhea,
Cramps, gas.
cramps, gas, yeah.
I mean, I'm not lactose intolerant, but I do know.
Yeah, well, you know what's on the slide. So these are the major symptoms that happen when people drink milk who are lactose intolerant. Okay? And so what happens with the bacteria that come into contact with that lactose, okay, again, because it wasn't degraded by any lactase, because we don't have any lactase, what the bacteria will do is they'll break down that lactose into carbon dioxide, hydrogen gas, methane gas, and water. Okay, and so that water is what kind of develops into the diarrhea, which is kind of where we get the mud butt, like my wife likes to call the diarrhea. We also get gas, which comes from the carbon dioxide, the hydrogen gas, and the methane gas. The bloating, the abdominal cramps, and all that discomfort all comes from this bacteria, all because we never had lactase to help degrade lactose instead. Okay. And so lactase is one of those brush border enzymes that we should have, but we don't. And so we end up with these other symptoms if we come into contact with any dairy.
Wait, so what creates mud butt?
So the mud butt the mud butt gets created by the water that the bacteria produce.
Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, and my wife also.
Oh, your wife heard that?
So yeah. So bubble guts is another one she likes to say too. So the bubble guts is where you get the gas, the bloating, the cramping, and things like that.
Oh my gosh. Okay, cool.
Yeah. So she's cool here. Mm-hmm.
So with lactose intolerance, is it can it come later in life? Because I think I've seen people who are totally okay and then later it just happens.
Yes. Yeah. So Sharon's question is, can lactose intolerance show up later in life? And that's exactly what happened to me. So I used to never be lactose intolerant. I used to drink milk like no problem. And then I went to grad school. I think I maybe stopped drinking milk for I don't know how many, for how long. And then I started drinking milk again. And then I would go to class. And then by the time I would get to class, I was like, yo, I got into the bathroom now. So for me, it developed later in life. And so that is something that can happen to some people. So some people are born with it. Some people, it kind of just develops over time.
Yeah, I got it after a while too.
Oh yeah?
I got just
so that is one thing that can happen.
Bloated with lots of cramps.
So then can you build that enzyme again?
I believe, I don't know. For me, I haven't been able to build it back. Yeah, I've tried, but it just hasn't. I don't know if you can ever build it back up. But in some case, I think some people are able to, some people are not. It just kind of depends.
You can lose it, but you can't gain it back.
Yeah. So I would think you would be able to gain it back. You can lose it if you're just like not kind of. I guess you get. It's almost like you if you don't use it, you lose it.
Yeah.
And so if you don't use it enough, then you can lose it over time. And then, but it takes some time to kind of get it back to where you're not having these symptoms. So it's interesting. I'm not sure if you can get it back. I would think you could, but I'm not too positive.
So how does it work with babies that are lactose intolerant? Is it the same thing?
With babies, kind of similar thing. Yeah. So basically, what happens? Same thing. So in babies, they're just kind of born without the lactose or the lactase enzyme, and so they just have the normal old gut bacteria that is degraded, and then you end up with those symptoms. So yeah, that's just one of those things that you can be either born with, or it can just kind of develop over time. Any other questions?
No.
Okay. All righty. So that's that.
Almond milk?
Oh, yeah. So I had to switch to almond milk. Or
Oh,
lactate. Yeah. So initially I switched to almond milk, but almond milk doesn't taste the same. Like, you can't have hot chocolate with almond milk. It doesn't sit right for me. And so I recently switched to lactate, and that one works. That one works. My belly's okay with that one. What did you say?
I said I've never seen udders on an almond.
Yeah, I don't know. I've tried it. It just, for me, I don't really like it that much. Yeah. But lactate's where it's at. Lactate works. And so in lactate and stuff like that, like, they don't have any lactose to cause, all those extra symptoms. Yeah. Okay. All right, so that's that. And so this is what the duodenum would look like under a microscope. You can see some of the microvilli on these, epithelial cells. And again, that helps with the absorption process here. Okay. All right, so now when we look at the small intestine has the ability to undergo some processes called segmentations. Okay? And so segmentations are kind of similar to peristalsis, but not exactly the same. Okay? In segmentations, what we have is you have coordinated contractions on both sides. So you contract it, you push it forwards, and then you contract again and push it backwards. And you kind of keep going, and contract. And the role of segmentations is to just mix the chyme that you're producing with all the intestinal juices. Okay? And that helps to ensure that you're able to kind of fully digest all of those particles and then be able to help ensure that you're able to absorb everything as well. Okay? But the role of segmentations is not to push things along the GI tract. Okay? Its only job is to just kind of mix all these substances so you can get maximal digestion and maximal absorption. Okay? And so this is going to be regulated by the myenteric plexus from the ENS. And so when that absorption takes place, the absorption is going to be happening through the intestinal cells using diffusion, facilitated transport, osmosis, and the active transport. Those same mechanisms we saw very early on in this semester. Okay. And so once this whole process has kind of mixed, once you have all of these secretions or all of your meal getting absorbed and digested, then segmentations will stop, and then peristalsis will begin to help push everything along going forward. Okay. All right, so question here. Which of the following structural features of the small intestine are specially adapted for the functions of digestion and absorption? So we got A, long length, B, circular folds, C, villi, D, microvilli, or E, all of the above. Nagin says E. What else do we say? Do we agree? Do we disagree?
E.
What do we feel?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, E.
Yes, E is correct. Yeah, so all of those will help to increase the surface area of the small intestines. As you have a larger surface area, that's going to help with maximal digestion and absorption. Okay, last part of the digestive system. So we're almost there. Sorry, it's going a little long. Last part is the large intestine. And so the large intestine is, actually, let me backtrack. Are there any questions on the small intestine before we go forward? Any questions before we go forward? No? Okay.
No,
All right, so large intestine is the last part of the GI tract. And so inside the large intestine, we're also going to find some bacteria that are going to be acting on the chyme as well. But then we're also going to be able to see some extra absorption. And there's not going to be a ton of absorption, but the only things that are going to be absorbed here are going to be some water, some ions, and a few vitamins as well. Okay? And in doing so, we're going to be able to form feces. Okay? The large intestine is going to run from the ileum of the small intestine all the way to the anus. Okay? And there's going to be 4 overall regions of the large intestine. Okay? First one is going to be the cecum, then we have the colon, the rectum, and then the anal canal. And so we're going to take a look at these here. So the first part that we're going to see is called the ileocecal sphincter, or the ileocecal valve, and that is going to be the entrance of the chyme from the ileum into the cecum of the large intestine. Okay, that's what we see over here. Okay. So this is going to be the sphincter of the valve that's going to allow that chyme to move from the small intestine into the large intestine. Okay. Then from there we reach the cecum, and so the cecum is going to be a small little pouch that hangs just beneath or inferior to the ileocecal valve. Then we have the appendix, and so the appendix is going to be this kind of worm-looking structure here that it gets attached to the cecum. And so this is the part that gets that can sometimes get inflamed and sometimes needs to be removed. So that's the appendix there. And then the last things that we're going to look at in the large intestine is going to be the haustra. Okay. So these haustra, or each individual haustrum, okay, these haustra are these pouches of the large intestine that are going to be kind of receiving some of that chyme. Okay. That's the first few parts here. Okay. Then we look at the colon. And so as food moves through the large intestine, it's going to be moving through the colon. So it's going to move from the cecum. It's going to move superiorly along the right side of your abdomen, okay, along the ascending colon. So ascending meaning it's going up. Okay. It's going to move up along the ascending colon. Okay. It's going to cross over to the left side as the transverse colon. Okay. Then as it moves to the left angle here, it's going to move inferiorly. It's going to kind of descend along the left side of your abdomen as the descending colon. And then once you reach the end of it, it's going to kind of form like an S-shaped structure, S-shaped portion here of the colon, and that's what we call the sigmoid colon. Okay. That's one way you can kind of remember that. It's kind of shaped like an S, so we call it the sigmoid colon. Okay. So we go from the cecum to the ascending colon, along the transverse colon, down the descending colon, and then into the sigmoid colon. Okay. And so the sigmoid colon will ultimately end up in the rectum. So as we kind of zoom in on the rectum is going to be kind of anterior to the sacrum and your coccyx, and it's going to end up forming your anal canal. Okay. So your anus is going to be the area that opens up from the anal canal into the exterior. Okay. So that's going to be that particular region there. Okay. Now the anus is going to get guarded by a couple different sphincters. Okay. The first sphincter is the internal anal sphincter, okay, which we see right here. So this is the internal anal sphincter. This is made up of smooth muscle, and as a result, it's going to be involuntary. Okay, so we cannot control the internal anal sphincter. Okay. And then the second sphincter is going to be the external anal sphincter, okay, which we see over here. This one is made up of skeletal muscle, and so this one is voluntary. Okay, so that is the one that we can voluntarily control. So have you ever been like outside, in public, and then all of a sudden you really got to poop, and you like are starting to clench your butthole so you don't poop? The part that you're contracting is the external anal sphincter. Okay. That's what helps you to kind of regulate or kind of help you physically control, your pooping. Okay.
I'm so sorry, you guys.
My wife's apologizing for you guys, but you guys are lucky to have me. Okay. Okay. All right. So when we look at the histology of the large intestine. The large intestine is going to have those same four layers. We have the mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and serosa. The only really kind of interesting thing here about the large intestine is the mucosa. There's going to be some intestinal glands. There's not going to be any villi, but the intestinal glands will have absorptive cells. And so those absorptive cells are going to have those microvilli that will, again, help with the absorption of water. Okay? So the large intestine's main job is to just absorb water. And in doing so, that's going to help you to be able to form your feces. Okay. Okay. Any questions so far on the large intestine?
No.
Okay. Okay. So in order to move our chyme through the large intestine, there's going to be three overall processes that are going to be happening. The first one is called haustral churning. Okay. And so remember, each of these little pouches here is what's called a haustra. So when some chyme fills one haustra, okay, you're going to have the chyme start to fill until the haustrum begins to stretch. Okay. Once that stretching reaches a particular threshold, there's going to be a reflex that's going to cause that haustrum to contract. And as it contracts, it's going to move the chyme into the next haustrum. And it's going to do the same thing. It's going to stretch as it fills. And then again, as it reaches a certain threshold, again, it squeezes and moves the chyme into the next posture. And it goes, kind of does that throughout the large intestine. Okay. The second process that's going to happen is peristalsis, same thing we've seen previously. And then the third process is mass peristalsis. Okay. So mass peristalsis typically begins at the transverse colon, and then it'll kind of run through the rest of the colon from here. And so what happens in mass peristalsis is you have these very large very strong peristaltic waves that push the chyme very strongly through the transverse colon, down the descending colon, through the sigmoid colon, and into the rectum very, very quickly. Okay. So that's going to be the fastest way to move the chyme through the large intestine. Okay, so that's that. Okay. So when we have food or when we have our chyme inside the large intestine, again, we're going to be having lots of bacteria here. Okay? The bacteria that's present there is going to be able to digest a few things as well. Okay? So any remaining carbohydrates that you didn't absorb are going to get degraded by the bacteria. Okay? And so the bacteria are going to degrade those carbohydrates in your chyme and release hydrogen gas, carbon dioxide gas, as well as methane gas, which contributes to your farting or your flatness or gas. Okay. Okay. The second thing that's going to happen is the bacteria can also break down any proteins and amino acids, that were not already degraded previously or digested previously. And so once it breaks those down into smaller substances, those substances actually contribute to the odor that is found in your feces. Okay. And the last thing that's going to happen is the bacteria are going to break down the bilirubin from the bile into stercobilin, and the stercobilin gives the feces its brown color. So that's how kind of feces gets its appearance. Okay. Now, as the chyme is in the large intestine, it's typically going to spend anywhere from about 3 to 10 hours, depending on what type of food you're eating, inside the large intestine. Okay. And so during that period of time, the large intestine is going to be pulling water out of the chyme, and as it pulls water out, it's going to cause that chyme to become more semi-solid or more solid. Okay. Again, you're basically kind of drying it out. You're pulling water out of the chyme, and so it's going to become more solid or semi-solid. Okay. And so like we said previously at the beginning, the feces is going to end up getting made of any digested materials that we didn't absorb previously, or any things that we were not able to digest, any water or salt that we weren't able to pull out, any bacteria, and then any sloughed off cells from the rest of the GI tract can also be absorbed or made up in the feces as well. Okay. So all of these different things can be found inside your feces. Okay, now, the last thing we got to do is we got to look at the process of how we are going to poop. Okay. We're going to look at the defecation process, and this is one that you also need to be comfortable with for the final exam. So this process is going to be regulated, is really going to start at the rectum. Okay. And so as the feces starts to make its way into the rectum and into the sigmoid colon, there's going to be some receptors inside the rectum that are responsible for determining how much stretch there is. Okay. So those are called stretch receptors. Okay. So once the stretch receptors get stimulated by the feces entering the rectum, what's going to happen is those stretch receptors are going to send impulses to the spinal cord. Okay. And so the spinal cord is going to be able to receive these impulses. It's going to say, okay, we got some feces here. We need to get this thing out. Okay. And so it's going to send some motor impulses from the spinal cord down to the muscles of the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the anus, as well as some of the rectal muscles. And then ultimately that's going to help to open up the internal anal sphincter and allow that to relax. Okay. So all this is going to be happening. So we've got stretch receptors running from the rectum, okay, sending those impulses to the spinal cord. The spinal cord will then send those impulses down to the different parts of the colon as well as the rectum, and begin causing them to contract, okay, as well as helping to open up the internal anal sphincter. Okay. And then what's going to happen here is when we're ready to poop, we're going to consciously relax our external anal sphincter. Okay. And again, that's going to allow the food to pass, or the feces to pass out of the rectum and then into the toilet in an ideal situation. Okay. So what's also kind of interesting here is that this is all going to be regulated by the parasympathetic division, even though sometimes it may seem like it's regulated by the sympathetic division. You know what I'm saying? So this is all going to be regulated by the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And so if we are not ready to poop, okay, then we're going to keep the external anal sphincter closed or constricted, okay, until we are ready to get to that toilet and then, you know, drop that deuce. So I'm way too unprofessional for this, but whatever. So that's the process of what's going to be happening when we're pooping. Okay. Again, we're going to have our stretch receptors getting stimulated. They're going to send that impulse to the spinal cord. Spinal cord is going to send motor impulses down to the rectum and to the colon and cause the internal anal sphincter to relax, okay, and open up. Then when we're ready to poop, we're going to consciously and voluntarily relax our external anal sphincter to allow defecation to occur. Okay. Any questions on this process here? And again, like I said, this is what I do want you to be familiar with for the exam.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So in addition to all of these muscles here in the rectum and the anus, there's also going to be a few other muscles that are going to help with the defecation process, namely the diaphragm and the abdominal muscles. So when we contract the diaphragm and the abdominal muscle, that helps to increase the pressure inside the abdomen. And as you increase the pressure inside the abdomen, that also increases the pressure inside the rectum and the sigmoid colon. Okay. So causing that increase in pressure, again, helps to kind of push all of that feces all the way up into the anus. So with infants, infants don't really have a whole lot of control over the defecation reflex. Basically what happens with infants is they, once their kind of internal anal sphincter opens, their external anal sphincter is always pretty much going to be open because they are not built, or they're not mature enough or developed enough to control the external anal sphincter. Okay? And so when they poop, they just poop. Whenever they got to poop, they just, you know, let it rip.
All out.
That is what it is. Exactly, it just kind of goes all out. And again, that's because they don't have any control of the external anal sphincter yet. Okay. That develops later on in life. Okay. Okay. Now that being said, with the large intestine's job, like I said, is to help pull out water, help to absorb water. Okay. Now, there are some certain conditions that can take place if we either absorb too much water or we don't absorb enough water. In the case where we don't absorb enough water, that is going to lead us to having mud butt or diarrhea. Okay? What typically happens is the chyme moves too quickly through the large intestine. Okay? And so if it moves too quickly, the large intestine doesn't have enough time to pull all that water out. Okay? And so if it doesn't have enough time to pull that water out, the feces tends to be more kind of liquidy, more watery. And there's going to be lots of electrolytes still in there as well, because again, the large intestine wasn't able to pull those electrolytes out. Okay. And so if someone has diarrhea, and so eventually that'll lead to diarrhea because again, you have watery feces because it wasn't able to pull much water out. Okay. So if you have diarrhea for long periods of time, that can ultimately lead to dehydration and some electrolyte imbalances. And so if you ever have diarrhea, or if you ever have kids who have diarrhea for long periods of time, the best way to kind of treat that is to give them like Pedialyte or Powerade or Gatorade, because those will help to replenish those electrolytes that they were losing through the feces and not absorbing. Okay. So that's going to be the best way to kind of combat diarrhea. Okay. Now the flip side of that is if the feces moves too slowly through the large intestine, okay, then the large intestine is going to be able to pull out too much water. Okay. And it's going to be pulling out so much water that the feces becomes very dry and very hard. That can lead to constipation if that feces gets stuck either in the rectum or the sigmoid colon or wherever it gets stuck at. Okay. And so that can create difficulty with defecation, and then it creates a lot of problems down the road. Okay. And again, that's just because the water was being pulled out too much. There's too much water getting pulled out and absorbed here, more so than ideal. Okay. And so that is that. Any questions with diarrhea and constipation?
No.
Pretty familiar with it.
Okay. All right. Okay, so question here. So which region of the gastrointestinal tract is responsible for most digestion and absorption of nutrients? So we got the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, small intestine, or large intestine.
Is it the small intestine?
Small intestine.
Small intestine.
Yes, that would be the small intestine. Perfect. Okay, that's that. Okay, so then I included this table at the end here to kind of show you what enzymes and substances will help to degrade or help to digest different molecules. So here you have the enzymes that help to break down starch. You have salivary amylase produced in the salivary glands, pancreatic amylase produced in the pancreas. You guys can read over this. This is just a table for your own kind of use to help with your studying as well. So again, I do want you to be comfortable with these enzymes and know where they're getting produced and what types of molecules and what types of foods they would be used to help to digest. Cool.
Okay, cool.
All right. That is it for today. Sorry, that was a very long one. I apologize. There's a lot in the digestive system. I just kind of wanted to get that done before we get into the next one. Any questions on anything we've covered today?
I have a question, but it doesn't have to do with the slide. Could you just go over what's going to be coming up and due for the due dates?
Yes. So coming up, what we have is our lab 20, which is the digestive system lab. That will be due ideally by Friday. So get that done as soon as you can. The other thing that's going to be due is we're going to have the last homework assignment. The last homework assignment will be due on Monday. The career essay will be due on Monday. And then the final exam will be 2 weeks from today.
And can you go over the career essay? Can you go over that?
It's posted.
Yeah, so the career essay, you're basically just going to write about whatever career you want to go into, either in the anatomy field or in the medical field. You're going to write about what that career is, what difference, like what things you may see in that field, both the good aspects of it and what's kind of the bad aspects that you might see as well. And then pretty much anything else that you want to write. So there's a requirement, or there's kind of the career essay requirements are posted up on Canvas. They're in the exam study guide section. So everything you need for that is going to be there. It's worth 50 points. It only needs to be about a page and a half to 2 pages. So it's very easy, probably the easiest 50 points you'll earn all semester. So make sure you get that done, and that'll be due on Monday. So that one, you can either email to me directly or you can submit it directly onto Canvas. Either one is fine, as long as I get it by Monday.
Okay.
I have the lab is due today. Did you change the due date for?
The lab, I had it due today, but realistically, I'm not really going to be able to get to it until Friday. So as long as it's submitted by Friday, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay. So we have the extra credit lab and this lab due Friday. Okay, got it.
Yes. Yeah. So the other extra credit lab, thank you for bringing that up. So the extra credit lab from the endocrine system, that one is also up on Canvas. That will be due on Friday as well. So that one is worth an additional 10 points. Again, it's optional. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. But if you do, you get extra credit for that.
Okay. And then the homework is already posted. I didn't see it earlier. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So the homework is posted. I posted it probably a half hour before class. So it's up now.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. No problem.
Okay. Good lecture. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
All right. Have a good one.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
George, I actually have a
Have a good one.
question on the functions of the pancreas. So pancreatic lipac, is it lipase or lipas, digest triglycerides?
Mhm.
Yeah. So like, is that digesting like fats, or what is that?
Yes. Yeah. So pancreatic lipase digests lipids. So basically, if you the kind of interesting thing about like lipases is that they'll usually all lipases will digest lipids. So if you're ever not sure, you can just think, okay, it's a I see lipase. So lipids or lipases always digest lipids. So anything that's a fat is going to get degraded by lipases.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.